Somewhere beyond the edge of the world, past the grey shores where souls drift and the rivers run cold, there is a meadow that never knows winter. The air there hums with something older than language, a warmth that has no source, a light that casts no shadow. Heroes rest here. The beloved sleep softly, and tonight, if you are still enough, the gates may open for you too. Take a moment to subscribe, but only if these stories genuinely bring you peace. Now find your quiet. The golden fields are already glowing. Long before any living soul thought to ask what waits beyond the last breath, the question was already being answered. Quietly, patiently, in a place no map has ever captured and no ship has ever reached by ordinary wind. The plain was there before the first war, before the first sword was lifted under a bronze sky, before the first mother wept at a city gate. It was simply there, as certain things simply are. But to understand what Elysium means, one must first understand what it costs to reach it. And to understand that cost, one must begin where all stories of death must begin, with the living and with their end. Troy had burned for 10 years. The city stood on a high plain above the sea, its towers pale in the morning haze, its walls built by divine hands, and therefore slower to fall than any human wall. But fall they did, and in the years before the falling, men died in numbers that strained the patience of the underworld itself. The rivers down below ran heavy with souls. The ferries were never still. Among all the men who fought beneath those walls, one stood apart. His name was already legend before he ever drew blood. Achilles, son of Peleus and the sea nymph Thetis, had been promised 2 fates from the very beginning of his life. He could live long and quietly, forgotten by history, or he could live brilliantly and die young, remembered forever. He had chosen the bright path. He had chosen it knowing exactly what it would cost. That choice hung over him on the plain of Troy like a blade suspended on a single thread of fate. He fought without equal. He moved through battle the way a storm moves through summer wheat. Men who had faced dozens of opponents across many campaigns turned aside when they saw him coming. His armor caught the light and held it. His grief, when it came, and it came with the death of his companion Patroclus, transformed into something that shook the walls of heaven, but the thread was always there. Thetis knew it. She had always known it, carrying her knowledge the way a river carries the cold of its source all the way to the sea. She had tried, in the early years, to protect him. She had dipped him in the river Styx, that black boundary water that separates the living world from what lies beyond it, holding him by the heel, submerging all the rest of him in the water that consecrates and armors and makes men briefly invulnerable. The heel she held remained dry. That small, unremarkable strip of skin remained mortal, and so the blade found him, as blades always find their mark when fate has inscribed the wound in advance. It was an arrow, not even a spear. An arrow guided by the god Apollo, loosed from the bow of Paris, finding that one dry patch of skin at the heel. The greatest warrior on the plain of Troy fell not in open combat against a worthy opponent, but by a small and secret wound that his mother's hand had left unguarded. The grief of Thetis when she came to him was not a small thing. The sea itself is said to have grown dark that day, as though even the ocean recognized that something irreplaceable had been removed from the living world. But here is where the story turns. Because death, for Achilles, was not the end that ordinary men endure. His body was given the rites his heroism demanded, the funeral pyre, the offerings, the mourning of an army. His ashes were gathered. But his soul, that bright and difficult thing, that ferocious, magnificent spirit that had burned so completely in life, did not simply drift toward the fields of asphodel to wander among the grey and purposeless shades. It did not dissolve into the half-life of forgetting that waited for common souls. His soul arrived where all souls arrive upon the completion of the crossing. It arrived before the judgment, and waiting there, as he had waited at his seat across more generations of the dead than any mortal could count, was Rhadamanthus. He was a son of Zeus, born in Crete from the great god's union with Europa. He had been in life a lawgiver of such scrupulous fairness that his name became synonymous with justice itself. Cultures that had never shared a language shared his reputation. A man of perfect judgment was said to possess the mind of Rhadamanthus. He had ruled in Crete with a steadiness that inspired awe rather than fear, and when his mortal life concluded, Zeus had not permitted such a mind to dissolve into purposelessness. He had been placed at the crossroads of the dead. There, at the judgment seat, souls arrived from every direction of the world and every era of its history. They came still carrying, in some ineffable sense, the imprint of everything they had done and failed to do. Everyone they had protected or abandoned, every vow they had kept, and every one they had broken. The coin that each soul had pressed against the tongue at the crossing was spent on the ferry. But a different accounting waited on the other side. Rhadamanthus did not shout his verdicts. He did not need to, he simply looked. And in that looking, which was patient and absolute, and carried no malice in it, the truth of a soul became legible. The whole arc of a life, its intentions and its actions, its moments of courage and its moments of cowardice, its love and its cruelty became as clear to him as writing on stone. 3 paths led away from his seat. One descended, dark, narrow, leading toward Tartarus and the punishments reserved for those who had made cruelty their occupation and arrogance their religion. One continued flat and grey, leading into the asphodel meadows, where the middling souls would walk and half remember and half forget until whatever came next. And one ascended toward a light that had no colour any living eye had words for, a warmth that moved like breath, a stillness that was not emptiness but completion. When Achilles stood at the judgment seat, the conflict that had defined his mortal life arrived with him. He had been magnificent, and he had been terrible. He had loved with a ferocity that moved gods to silence, and he had raged with a ferocity that stripped the plain of Troy of any mercy for a season. He was not a simple soul. He never had been. Rhadamanthus looked at him for a long, unhurried moment. The hero said nothing. There was nothing to say that the looking had not already found. Outside the judgment hall, if that word applies to a place without walls or ceiling, the river Lethe ran its grey and forgetting course. And somewhere beyond it, in a direction the living have no name for, the west wind moved softly over golden grass. Rhadamanthus raised one hand. It was a small gesture, unhurried, the kind a man makes when a decision has already been reached and only the announcement remains. Achilles turned toward the ascending path. He did not look back. That was not in his nature, and whatever nature a soul carries from its mortal life, it carries still in those first moments after crossing. He moved with the same forward motion that had carried him across the plains of Troy, through the dust and the noise and the 10 years of siege. Only now the dust was gone. The noise was gone, and the path beneath him was not hard-packed earth, but something softer, something that gave slightly with each step as though the ground itself were accommodating his passage. The light ahead of him had no sharp edge. It did not blaze. It simply extended, the way warmth extends from a hearthstone long after the fire itself has gone quiet. He walked toward it, and it accepted him the way a harbour accepts a ship that has been at sea long enough, far behind him. In the living world, the war at Troy continued for a while longer without him. The walls still stood. The armies still gathered each morning on the plain. Men still died in the narrow space between the gates and the ships. But something had changed in the composition of those days. A quality of absolute danger, a specific brightness that certain battles carry, had dimmed. The Greeks went on fighting with skill and with courage, but the ferocity that had made their enemies careful in a particular way was no longer present on the field. Troy would fall. But that is a story that moves in a different direction from this one. This story follows the shore beyond the living world, where the west wind breathes and the golden grass does not bend so much as sway, and where a different kind of reckoning was already being prepared. There was a man, still alive on that plain, who had received a prophecy. His name was Menelaus. He was a king, a husband, a man who had watched 10 years burn away in the effort of reclaiming one particular woman from one particular city. He was not the greatest warrior at Troy, and he did not pretend to be. He fought because the war was his, in the most personal sense available to a king. Helen was his wife. The insult was his. The obligation to respond had fallen on him as surely as rain falls on an uncovered field, whether the field wants it or not. He had spent a decade on those plains, in the shadow of his brother Agamemnon's greater command, in the shadow of Achilles' greater ferocity, in the shadow of Odysseus's greater cunning. He had fought well, and suffered quietly, and waited with the patience of a man who understands that patience is sometimes the only honourable option. And then the war ended. And then the sea took him. The return from Troy was not gentle for the Greeks. The gods had reasons to be displeased, and the ships scattered on the homeward wind like leaves from a shaken branch. Menelaus lost his course. He drifted. He was carried south, and then east, and then south again, and the familiar names of the Greek sea gave way to stranger waters. The coast of Egypt rose before him, pale and flat against a sky he did not recognize. He was stranded there for a time, waiting for a wind that did not come. His ships sat in the harbour, and his men grew restless, and the days accumulated without purpose. On the island of Pharos, off the Egyptian coast, there lived a god who knew the shape of the sea's secrets. His name was Proteus. He was old, older than the gods of Olympus, older than the war that had occupied Menelaus's best years. He was the old man of the sea, a creature of change and deep knowing, who rested on the shore each midday with his seals around him, who could be seized and held, but who would transform through a dozen shapes before yielding what he knew. Menelaus, advised by Proteus's daughter Eidothea, covered himself and 3 companions in fresh sealskin. They lay among the sleeping seals in the noonday heat and waited. When Proteus descended from the sea and counted his flock and lay down among them, they seized him. What followed was strange and slow and exhausting. Proteus became a lion. He became a serpent. He became water, and then fire, and then a great leafed tree. Menelaus held on through all of it. His men held on. The transformations came and went like tides. And finally, when Proteus had exhausted all his changes, he returned to his own form and lay still, and he spoke. He told Menelaus why the winds had been withheld. He told him what rituals were owed, and to which gods, and in what form. He told him how to reach his home again, and then he told him something else. He told him what waited at the end. Not the grey fields, and the forgetting, and the slow dispersal of everything a man had been, something else entirely. He told Menelaus that the Elysian plain was prepared for him, that he would not know an ordinary end, that the gods had marked him differently, not because of his own deeds alone, but because of who he was by marriage, because the blood of Zeus ran through his family's arrangement with heaven, because Helen, in all her complicated and devastating beauty, had made him the son-in-law of the supreme god. These things, Proteus said, had been decided. The Elysian plain, no snow, no bitter wind, no winter of any kind. Only the west wind, the gentle one, breathing in from the sea in long and quiet exhalations, moving through grass that did not know frost, beneath a light that carried warmth without weight. Menelaus listened. He was standing on an Egyptian beach with sealskin still on his shoulders and the smell of the sea very present around him. He was tired. He had been tired for years. The word Elysium meant nothing concrete to him yet. It was a word for a place he had never seen, described by an old god he had barely managed to restrain for long enough to hear the truth from. But something in it settled into him, not joy. Precisely, not relief. Something quieter. The faint recognition that the long effort, the years of war and the years of sea and the years of waiting, was not simply spending itself toward nothing, that there was a destination written into his life's account that did not end in the grey fields of forgetting. He did not know what the Elysian plain looked like. He could not have imagined, standing on that beach with sand under his boots and salt drying on his skin, the specific quality of the light there. The way the grass moved, the way the air held warmth without pressing it upon you, but the word had been spoken over him by an ancient knowing creature. And words spoken that way do not leave easily. He stood for a moment longer on the beach. The sea was very quiet in that midday hour. The seals had returned to the water. Eidothea had gone. Proteus had dissolved back into the grey-green shallows, already forgetting the conversation as only gods can forget. The sun pressed down with the particular weight of an Egyptian afternoon. Menelaus rolled the sealskin from his shoulders. He looked at the horizon. Somewhere beyond it, past the familiar sea and the familiar coast and the familiar grief of a decade's misdirection, his home waited. Sparta, the stone halls and the olive groves, and Helen, who was already in some version of events being arranged by the gods, making her own way back to him. He would reach her. The prophecy had weight to it. Not urgency, not the sharp pressure of impending doom, but the slow, quiet gravity of something already inscribed. He would reach her. He would grow old in Sparta. He would one day stand at the edge of the living world and find the west wind waiting for him, steady and cool and carrying no grief in its passage. He did not know. Standing there on the Egyptian shore, that a hero named Achilles had already walked that ascending path. He did not know that the realm he had been promised was already receiving its first inhabitants. He did not know what Rhadamanthus looked like, or what the judgment seat felt like to stand before, or how the golden grass moved when the west wind found it. He only knew the word. Elysium. He folded it somewhere inside him. The way a man folds a document he does not yet need but intends to keep, and he turned back toward his ships. Far from the Egyptian shore, in a place that belonged to no map any living sailor had ever drawn, a different kind of arrival was taking place. The path that Achilles walked grew easier as it rose. Not steep, not laboured, the kind of rising that a man feels in his chest more than in his legs, the gradual sense of a burden releasing its hold. Behind him, the grey territories of the recent dead had already grown indistinct, folded back into themselves like mist retreating from morning. Ahead, the light continued its quiet offering, warm and unhurried, falling from no visible source, as though the air itself had learned to glow. He did not pause to consider it. That was not his nature. It had not been his nature in life, and whatever he carried into this place, he carried whole. But even Achilles, walking forward with his characteristic directness, noticed when the path beneath him changed. The yielding softness of the ascending ground became something firmer. Grass. Real grass, the kind with weight to it, the kind that presses back when stepped on. And then the grass began to catch the light differently. A gold that was not the gold of harvest fields, not the gold of late afternoon on any particular hillside, but something more considered, as though each blade had been placed. He stopped. Not from doubt. From recognition. This was the place. The judgment seat stood some distance behind him now, already receding, and there, at that seat, the work of arrivals continued without pause. Rhadamanthus had been given his appointment before memory began. He had been a lawgiver on Crete first, in the years when Crete still hummed with prosperity, and its courts were known from one end of the sea to the other as the most impartial in the world. He had written laws without fear of the powerful. He had rendered verdicts without consideration of what they would cost him personally. His brother Minos had ruled beside him then, both of them sons of Zeus and Europa. Born from the same impossible union of a god who had taken the form of a white bull and a princess who had not turned away from the strangeness of it, Minos had his own qualities. Shrewder, perhaps. More attentive to the mechanisms of power, more careful about how authority presented itself to those who would be governed by it. He had built an empire from Crete. He had given laws to a people who would speak his name for generations after the empire itself had crumbled. But Rhadamanthus had understood something that law alone could not carry. He had understood that justice was not a system. It was a perception, a willingness to see clearly without the distortions that self-interest places in the line of sight. He had practiced that seeing for an entire mortal life and had grown very still from the practice, not cold. Still, the way deep water is still at the bottom while the surface moves. When the third judge arrived, the tribunal took its final shape. Ajax came from Aegina. From a different lineage than his two colleagues, though they shared the same divine father. His mother was Aegina, a daughter of the river Asopus, for whom the island had been named. Zeus had carried her there, and Ajax had been born, and from the beginning there was something in him that drew people toward fairness. He had ruled Aegina well, justly, with a patience that mortal kings often admired from a distance and rarely managed to imitate. The three of them had been brought together not by accident and not entirely by choice. Zeus had appointed them. That was the full explanation, but the appointment had taken hold, the way true appointments do, not by force but by fit. These three men, each shaped separately by lives of practiced justice, found in each other a quiet accord that required no ceremony to establish. Rhadamanthus held the deep and unwavering perception. Minos held the administrative precision, the long memory of precedent and consequence. Ajax held something softer but no less necessary, a quality of attentiveness to what a soul had faced in life. The specific difficulties that circumstance places in the way of virtue, together they formed something whole. They did not discuss their verdicts aloud. That was not how it worked. Each soul arrived at the crossroads below the golden fields, and each judge brought his understanding to bear, and from that bearing a direction emerged, left toward Tartarus, straight into the asphodel meadows, where ordinary souls drifted without great pain and without great joy, or right toward the ascending path, toward the light that Achilles was walking into now. Rhadamanthus had raised his hand a moment ago, the quiet signal. One hand, lifted and lowered, Achilles had been directed toward the right. The judgment had not been difficult. Some were not difficult. Some arrivals carried with them an inner coherence, a life that had been what it set out to be, fully and without apology. The evaluation of such souls does not require lengthy consideration. The three judges looked, and the answer was already settled, the way a scale settles when the weights are clearly unequal, on the golden plain. Achilles stood in the grass and let the warmth of it settle over him. No armour now. He had not arrived with armour, though he had died in it. What a soul carries into this place is not the physical accumulation of a life. It is the essential aspect, the core of what a person had been when stripped of every circumstance. He was still recognizably himself. That directness, that intensity which was not aggression but something more like complete attention, the quality of a man who was never partly present in anything he did. But the pain was gone, not suppressed, not managed. Gone. The long grief he had carried for Patroclus, the cold fury of the years after his friend's death, the exhaustion of being so perpetually, unavoidably extraordinary in a world that could not stop putting demands on that quality. It had all set down. He stood in the grass and breathed the warm, still air, and somewhere across the golden plain, somewhere in the middle distance where the light softened and the flowers grew thick and yellow, there was movement. Other souls already settled here, moving through the meadows at their own pace. He did not rush toward them. He was done rushing. The west wind moved through the grass around his feet, slow, unhurried, carrying the faint salt of a distant sea. It was a gentle thing, that wind. It had been described to certain living men as the only breath the plain ever knew. No cold, no biting, only this long, soft exhalation from somewhere offshore, returning again and again without urgency, spending itself across the golden fields without ever diminishing. Rhadamanthus, from his place at the judgment seat, watched the path. Another arrival was already crossing toward him. The work of seeing clearly had no end. But it was, in its own austere way, a work he had been born for, and the place it served, glowing quietly in the middle distance beyond his station, made the labour comprehensible. He lowered his gaze to the soul now standing before him, measured it. Let the perception do its long, quiet work, and the grass moved in the golden fields, and the wind moved through it, and the warmth held without pressing, just as the old sea-god on an Egyptian shore had described it, speaking the word into the salt air to a tired king who had not yet understood what he was being promised. Below the golden fields, the judgment seat received another soul. Rhadamanthus observed it, measured the span of what had been lived, set it against the long register of his perception. Ajax was still. Minos held the precision of a man who has weighed 10,000 such moments and trusts the instrument he has become. The verdict came without ceremony. The soul was directed straight ahead into the asphodel meadows. Not a difficult life, not a ruinous one. Ordinary in the way that most lives are ordinary. An honest man who had not risen to virtue so much as he had failed to fall very far from it. The meadows would hold him without cruelty. Rhadamanthus lowered his hand and turned his attention back to the path that led upward into the light. He watched it for a moment. That ascending track, pale and unhurried, curving gently away from the crossroads and disappearing into the glow where the fields began. He had walked that path himself. Long ago, before the appointment, he remembered what it had felt like to cross from one kind of existence into another, the moment when the warmth reached the chest and settled there and did not move again. He did not dwell on it. Another soul was already on the lower road, still distant, moving toward the crossroads with the particular uncertainty of recent arrivals. That uncertainty never looked the same twice. Some came with it worn openly, like a garment too large for the body. Others carried it inside, invisible, audible only in the way they held their breath when they stopped before the three judges. He would wait. That was the full nature of the work. Perceive clearly, wait. Perceive again. On the golden plain above, the west wind continued its slow passage through the grass. Achilles had moved a little, not far, a few steps toward the middle distance, where the yellow flowers grew thickest and the light took on a softer quality, as though it had travelled a long way and was glad to rest against something solid. He had not yet spoken to the other souls he could see moving there. There was no urgency in it. The plain held something that made urgency feel like a language from another world, one he had spoken fluently once, and now had simply no occasion to use. He could see one figure at some distance, moving slowly through the flowers, unhurried, as everything here was unhurried. He did not call out. He watched, felt the wind move past his shoulders, carrying that faint salt quality that seemed to belong to no particular direction, to come from everywhere offshore at once. There was something in the wind today. Achilles noticed it without being able to name it. A faint quality, a suggestion of something not yet arrived. The wind carried the warmth it always carried and the salt it always carried, but beneath those familiar notes there was something else. Something that had not been there when he first stepped onto the plain. Not a sound. Not a smell exactly. More like the feeling that a room holds when a door at the far end has been quietly opened. The air does not change, the light does not change, but the room itself knows. He stood still in the grass and let the feeling move through him. It did not trouble him. Nothing here had the quality that trouble required. But it was there. A suggestion, faint as a word said at great distance, just below the threshold of hearing. Across the plain the other figure had stopped too, an older soul. One who had been here long enough to know the plain's moods, the small variations in its stillness. That soul stood in the field with its face turned toward the west, where the faint glow of the offshore light blurred at the horizon into something hazier and more distant, listening perhaps, or simply attending. The wind passed between them, then moved on. In the lower reaches, at the judgment seat, Ajax turned his face slightly, not toward the plain above, not toward the arriving soul still making its way down the lower road, toward something that was not a direction at all. His quality of attentiveness did not rest only with the souls that came before him. It rested with the plain itself. He had learned this slowly. The plain was not simply a place where blessed souls waited. It received things. It knew what approached before the approach became visible. Something was approaching. He could not say what. The knowledge did not arrive with detail. It arrived the way certain evenings arrive, carrying a heaviness that has no source, a feeling that the next day will be different from all the days before it without announcing how. He said nothing to Minos, nothing to Rhadamanthus. They would perceive it in their own ways, at their own intervals. That was how the accord between them worked. No explanation required. What was real would become visible in time, and they would each know it when it did. The soul on the lower road had reached the crossroads now, stood before the three of them. A woman, a life that had spanned some decades of ordinary suffering and ordinary grace. The proportions mixed in ways that were not uncommon and not easily reduced to a single verdict. Ajax turned his attention fully to her, took in what circumstance had placed in her path, what she had done with what she had been given. The perception moved through him slowly, carefully, without hurry. Minos held his long memory. Cross-referenced. Let precedent settle into place beside the particular. Rhadamanthus observed. The three bearings came to rest as they did, as they had with every soul that stood in this spot. The direction emerged not from any one of them, but from all three at once, from the place where three separate kinds of clarity became a single clear thing. Rhadamanthus raised his hand. One hand lifted, then lowered, toward the right, toward the ascending path. The woman's face changed. Not surprise exactly, something closer to recognition. As though the verdict confirmed what she had suspected about herself and had not been certain she deserved to believe. She turned toward the ascending path and began to walk. The plain received her, and the grass moved around her feet, and the yellow flowers were visible ahead of her in the softened light. On the plain above, Achilles watched her appear at the top of the path, watched her slow steps into the grass, felt, without knowing why, that something about the moment held a weight beyond itself, a suggestion of other arrivals to come, of other paths that had not yet been walked, of doors at far ends of large rooms, not yet opened, not yet even visible, but present somehow in the quality of the air. The west wind moved through the grass between them, carried its salt, its warmth, its faint intimation of something offshore, patient and unhurried, still coming. He did not look away from the horizon. The light there held its soft blur. The way light holds at great distance when what is approaching it has not yet arrived. The light at the horizon did not change. But something in the lower reaches of the underworld shifted, faintly, the way a great bell shifts when a smaller one is struck nearby. Not a sound that carried upward, more a correspondence. The plain noted it in the language it used for such things, which was not language at all, far below the ascending path. Beyond the crossroads where the three judges sat, a figure was making its way through territory that was not meant for the living. The figure moved with purpose. That much was clear from the way the surrounding air organized itself around him, not the drifting passage of souls who had finished with the world and were learning the geography of what came next. This was forward motion, directed, carried by something other than the ordinary compulsion of the dead. He was not dead. That distinction mattered in the lower reaches. The dead moved through those roads wearing their deaths lightly, the way water wears the shape of whatever holds it. But a living man moving through that place carried his living with him like a lamp carried into a dark room. The darkness did not become the lamp. The lamp did not become the darkness. Each remained what it was, and the distinction between them made itself known at every step. Orpheus moved with his lyre held close. He had not played it in some time. He was saving it. He understood, in the way that a man who has thought carefully about an impossible thing comes to understand its requirements, that the music was not a tool to be spent freely. It was the argument he had come to make, and one does not make an argument piecemeal. The road through the lower reaches was not what he had imagined. He had imagined darkness, absolute and cold. What he found instead was a kind of grey adequacy, light that was enough to see by but carried no warmth. Sufficient, no more than that. The souls around him did not notice him particularly. They were occupied with their own passage, their own uncertain orientation toward whatever came next. Occasionally one turned, registered something unusual in his presence, turned away again. He was not their concern. He walked. The road descended before it began to level, then levelled, and in the levelling the quality of the air changed. He had entered the fields of asphodel. He did not slow his pace, but he looked. The asphodel meadows stretched away on either side of the road, broad and grey-grassed. The pale flowers growing in irregular clusters that reached no particular height and held no particular interest. Souls moved through those fields with a kind of gentle purposelessness. They were not suffering. That was notable. They were not in pain, not in anguish, not in any state that required relief. They simply were. Existing, persisting, waiting perhaps, though waiting implied an expectation of change, and he was not certain these souls retained that much. He kept walking. The crossroads came into view. 3 figures sat at its centre, and even from a distance, even with the grey light flattening everything around them, these 3 held a quality the rest of the landscape lacked. They were attending to everything all at once with a steadiness that was not effort but nature. Orpheus stopped. He breathed. He settled the lyre more firmly in the crook of his arm. Then he began to play. The music did not fill the space the way sound fills rooms above ground. Here it moved differently. It moved into things, into the grey air, into the grey grass, into the stones of the road and the pale flowers of the asphodel, into the souls drifting through the adjacent meadows, who slowed their drifting and stood more still. It moved into the 3 judges. Minos looked up from what his long memory was holding. The precedents settled into quiet. The catalogues of lives and their proportions ceased their internal movement and simply rested. Ajax, who had been attending to the plain above, who had been sitting with the knowledge of something approaching without being able to name it, turned his full attention downward and held it there. The music was not what he had been sensing, but the music was related to it. A leading edge, a first arrival. Rhadamanthus did not move. He never moved unnecessarily, but something in his expression altered minimally, in the way a balance alters when a weight is added with great care to one of its pans. Orpheus kept playing. The music said what he had come to say without words. It named Eurydice. It named what she had been. Not her beauty, though that was present in it. Not his need, though that was present too. It named the particular shape of one person known to another over time, the specific grammar of a life lived alongside. The way certain silences mean more than speech. The way absence, when it is the absence of something precisely known, has dimensions that generic grief does not. The three judges heard all of this. They heard it not as judges adjudicating a case, but as beings who had. Each of them carried knowledge of what it meant to lose things. Minos held his long memory, and in it were the weights of all the lives he had ever measured. And in that measuring was the accumulated understanding that what mattered in a life was not its length, but its density of love. Ajax, son of a god and a mortal woman, had understood from his earliest years that the mortal half of him was the half that grieved. Rhadamanthus had made judgments across a vast number of souls, and in doing so had come to understand that loss was not the opposite of justice. Sometimes it was its condition. The music moved on. It reached the place where the asphodel thinned, where the grey grass gave way to something else, further along the road, at a distance Orpheus could see but not yet reach, a light that was different from the grey adequacy of the meadows, warmer, softer, carrying something in it that the asphodel light did not carry. He did not play toward that light. He played toward the judges, but the music knew where it was. The music knew Eurydice was there, somewhere in that warmer distance, and it bent slightly in that direction without his willing it. Rhadamanthus observed this. He observed the way the music strained without straining, the way a man's whole body orients toward what his hands cannot reach. The three judges sat with the music for a long time. Above, on the golden plain, the feeling that had been moving through Achilles for some while sharpened slightly, not into clarity, not into a named thing, but the formlessness of it became more specific. The approaching thing was not a soul arriving by the usual path. It was a negotiation, a mortal voice making a case in a place that did not usually hear mortal voices. He turned from the horizon, looked toward the ascending path, looked at the place where the pale path disappeared into the lower distance. The wind moved through the grass around him, carried its salt, its warmth, carried something else now too, threaded through the familiar notes. Something that sounded almost like a string instrument heard from very far away. He could not be certain. He stood in the yellow flowers and listened, and the plain listened with him. And in the lower reaches the music continued to make its careful and heartbroken argument to the three who had the authority to answer it. The music ended, not all at once. It tapered. The last note moved into the stone beneath Orpheus's feet and did not return. The crossroads settled back into its grey quiet, though the quiet was not the same quiet as before. Something had passed through it. The air remembered. Orpheus lowered the lyre. His arms ached. He had not noticed the aching while he played. Now it came to him all at once, the weight of the instrument, the weight of the descent, the weight of everything he had been carrying since the morning on the river bank when the world changed. He waited. Rhadamanthus was the first to speak. His voice was neither warm nor cold. It held neither sympathy nor its absence. It held what it had always held, precision. The words placed with care, each one necessary, none decorative. He said, "The case is understood." That was all, but it was not a small thing. In this place, to be understood by Rhadamanthus was not a casual acknowledgment. It meant the full account had been received, weighed, found to contain what it claimed to contain. Minos sat with his hands resting open on his knees. The long memory had grown still during the music. Now it began to move again, but differently, not cataloguing, comparing, reaching back across its vast collection for what resembled this. What had come before a case like this? Whether precedent existed? It did not exactly. The underworld had received countless souls who carried grief, But it had not often received the grief itself, walking, breathing, making its argument in person. Aeacus had not looked away from Orpheus since the music began. He looked at him now with an expression that was not pity. It was recognition. The mortal half of him knew what it was to stand in a place of judgment and ask for what seemed, by all reasonable measure, impossible. The three judges exchanged nothing, not a word, not a gesture. They did not need to. Their deliberation was not a conversation. It was a convergence. Three minds, shaped by long practice at the same task, moving toward the same point from different angles. Orpheus stood in the crossroads light and waited. He did not plead further. The music had said everything. To speak now would be to diminish it. The grey light sat around him. The pale asphodel flowers stood in their irregular clusters. The road behind him stretched back through the meadows. The road ahead moved toward that warmer glow, still distant, still carrying that different quality in its light. Rhadamanthus spoke again. He said, "She may follow." He paused. He said, "You will not look back." The condition arrived without severity, without warning. It was simply the shape of the thing, the structure of the permission itself. As a door has dimensions, as a river has a current, this allowance had its nature. He may take her, he may not see her until they reach the living world. The rule was not a punishment. It was the architecture of the agreement. Orpheus heard it. He understood it in the way a person understands something they will later, in the grip of a moment they cannot predict. "Forget," he said, "I understand." Aeacus rose from his place at the crossroads and walked the lesser road, not the main path. A side road that curved away from the grey meadows and toward the warmer light. He moved with the unhurried certainty of a figure who knows all the roads in this country by habit. He disappeared into the light that was different from the grey light. Orpheus waited. The crossroads was quiet. Minos had returned to his long memory, which now moved again through its catalogues, measuring the weight of the exchange. Rhadamanthus sat without moving. His expression returned to its neutral precision. Time passed. In this place, time moved differently. It did not press. It accumulated, the way sediment accumulates at the bottom of still water. Then Aeacus returned. Behind him, a step behind. Moving with the careful hesitance of someone newly unmoored from stillness, came Eurydice. She was not as the living are. The underworld had been working on her, these weeks or months since the river bank, this unmeasured interval of asphodel and grey light. She was translucent in the way the other souls were translucent. Her edges were softer. Her movement was the gentle drift of a being who had grown accustomed to not needing to go anywhere but her face. Her face remembered him. Orpheus did not turn. He held very still. The living warmth of him radiated outward in the grey air. The lamp of his body visible to everything in this country that had no lamps of its own. He heard her step behind him. He heard the particular quality of that step, the exact weight of it, the precise interval between one footfall and the next. He began to walk. She followed. Above them, on the golden plain, Achilles had not moved from where the sound had reached him. The string instrument was gone now from the wind. In its place, a silence with a particular texture. Not empty, full. The way a silence is full when something has just been decided. He stood in the yellow flowers and felt it. He did not know what had been decided. He knew only that something in the lower reaches had shifted. Some arrangement had been made that the whole underworld now held in its fabric. A thread had been added. A new tension ran through the weave of the place. The salt wind moved through the plain. The golden flowers nodded in it. The light here was warm and stable. It had always been warm and stable. It did not waver. Achilles turned back toward the plain. The vast sweep of it extended before him, golden and unhurried, the warm light sitting evenly over the grass, the distant sound of the ocean threading through everything, patient and low. Somewhere in the lower distance, a living man was walking toward the upper world, and behind him walked a shade, and the distance between them was the distance of a promise held against the full weight of love. The plane did not comment on this. The plane simply held its warmth, its flowers, its long, unhurried peace, and waited, as it always waited, for what the road would bring next. And far below, at the crossroads where the three judges sat, Rhadamanthus placed his hands together, the way a man places his hands when a matter has been closed, not resolved exactly, not concluded, but settled for now into its proper shape. He returned his attention to the work. The crossroads received its grey light. The asphodel stood in its clusters. The road toward the warmer distance was empty again, two figures moving along it somewhere out of sight, the smaller lamp of the living man carrying its warmth up through the dark, and behind it the softer glow of Eurydice, following at the exact distance the condition required. The crossroads fell further behind with each step Orpheus took. The grey light remained grey. The asphodel remained pale and still on either side of the road, its flowers half open, holding themselves in that permanent condition of almost bloom. Nothing here rushed toward anything. The road itself seemed less a path made for walking than a fact about the landscape, a feature that had existed before the first soul arrived to use it. Orpheus walked. Behind him, Eurydice moved at the interval the condition required. One step behind. The particular sound of her footfall, that soft displacement, that nearly absent weight, continued its patient rhythm in the grey air. He did not turn. He measured the road by the feel of it beneath his feet, and by the gradual change in the light ahead, which was shifting by degrees too small to name precisely but visible. Over time, as a difference, the warmth ahead was growing. Not warmth like sunlight striking stone. Warmth like a room that has been lived in, like air that has held the presence of the living for a long time and retained something of that presence in its texture. The asphodel thinned at the margins of the road. Then it was gone. In its place came grass. Not the grey grass of the upper meadows, where the common shades drifted in their quiet thousands. Different grass. Longer, and carrying something in its colour that the grey world had been incapable of. The road widened, and from the wider road, somewhere off to the left and distant, came the sound that Achilles had been living inside for all his time in this country. The ocean, low, continuous, patient. It did not surge. It moved with the measured breathing of something very large and very old. The sound of it settled into the air, the way large sounds settle, not filling space exactly, but residing in it. Orpheus stopped walking. He could not see what lay to either side. The condition of the agreement did not allow him to turn. But he could hear it. He could feel the shift in the air against the side of his face, a pressure that was different from the grey country's stillness. Softer, moving. Behind him, Eurydice had also stopped. Her stillness had a quality distinct from the stillness of the shades he had passed on the descent. The shades of the asphodel stood in their stillness, the way water stands still in a basin, because nothing disturbs it, because nothing in them retained the impulse toward motion. Eurydice's stillness was different. It was the stillness of a person who has paused to listen. She was listening to the ocean. The sound of it moved through her, the way sound moves through a bell after the bell has been struck. She had been here long enough in this country to have forgotten what moving water sounded like. The grey meadows had no water that moved. The asphodel had no wind. And now the sound reached her, and something in her that had been very quiet for a long time received it. Orpheus did not see this. He heard her footstep resume behind him, and he began walking again. The road curved slightly. The grass on either side deepened in colour, taking on the quality that would later in the upper world be described as gold, though the word did not fully hold it. It was more accurate to say the grass had a particular relationship with the light, and the light here was warm and stable in the way the crossroads light had not been. The crossroads light existed. This light did more than exist. It resided. Tiresias sat at the margin of the road. He sat on a flat stone at the place where the road curved, his hands folded in his lap. His face turned toward the sound of the ocean in the way a face turns toward something it has long since accepted rather than anticipated. He was blind, and had been blind in life, and death had done nothing to restore what life had taken. But his mind remained what it had always been in life, intact, precise. Gathering. The souls around him drifted in the way the common shades drifted, the grey and gentle aimlessness of those who no longer knew their own names, who had arrived in the asphodel and been dispersed into its grey anonymity. They moved past him without seeing him in any meaningful way. He was simply a shape in the landscape to them. They were simply sound to him. The soft displacement of their movement, the barely there murmur of their passage. He heard Orpheus before he saw him. The living man's warmth announced him from 50 steps away. The particular density of the living, the way a body that still contains its blood and breath, differs from the translucent population of this country. Reached Tiresias with the clarity of all things that reach a blind man who has had a long time to refine his listening. He heard the footstep behind Orpheus as well. 2 sets of steps, one living, one not, the precise interval between them. He did not speak as they passed. There was nothing to say, and Tiresias had learned, in a very long time of sitting at the margin of roads in this country, that the interventions of prophets were not always the gift they imagined themselves to be. He had given enough knowledge to enough mortals in enough moments. He understood now what the knowledge did to them, how it landed in the mind and sat there, heavy with its own weight, displacing other things. He let them pass. Orpheus and Eurydice moved along the road. The prophet sat on his stone. The ocean continued its steady address to the air. After a time, Tiresias turned his face away from the road and back toward the ocean sound. He had been watching this country for a long time. He had seen many souls arrive. He had seen the common shades dispersed into the asphodel, drifting without names. He had seen the worse ones led away toward the dark road that descended rather than rose. And he had seen, now and then, a soul arrive that moved differently, that carried itself with the particular quality of one who will not be dispersed. Those souls moved past the asphodel altogether. They moved toward the warmth that was gathering ahead of where Orpheus now walked, toward the plain that held the ocean sound in its fabric and the grass that held the light. Achilles was there, and around him, distributed across the great golden expanse of the plain, were others, not drifting the way the asphodel shades drifted, moving with purpose, with the ease of figures who knew where they were and had accepted the knowledge without grief. The plain received all of this without comment. The grass bent under the soft movement of the wind that came from the direction of the ocean. The light sat steady and warm over everything. And Tiresias, sitting at the margin where the grey world met the golden one, remained on his stone at the boundary, belonging to neither territory entirely, retained by the terms of his particular existence in full knowledge of both. He heard the living man's footsteps fade along the road. He heard the softer footsteps fade behind them. Then the road was quiet again, and the ocean continued. And the grass moved, and the grey country lay behind him with its pale flowers and its accumulated silence, and somewhere ahead the plain received the wind from the water as it always received it, patiently, without surprise, in the long, warm, undisturbed afternoon of the blessed dead. The road ahead of Orpheus changed as he walked it, not suddenly, not with any threshold he could name. The change was gradual, the way warmth enters a room before a fire is fully lit. First the idea of warmth, then the thing itself. The grass on either side stood taller. The light, which had been accumulating for some distance, settled into something complete. And the sound of the ocean, which had been distant, became present in a different way, not louder, more inhabited. The road itself narrowed slightly. Then it ended, not on a wall or a gate. It ended at a wide stone platform, low and flat, worn smooth by an uncountable number of feet. 3 figures sat behind it. 3 presences, distinct from one another, held in their places by a function older than any name: Rhadamanthus, Minos, Ajax, the tribunal of the dead. Orpheus stopped. He had not expected this. He had passed through the fields and the grey distances and the margins. He had walked the road where the blind prophet sat. He had felt the warmth ahead of him thickening into something substantial. He had believed, perhaps, that the passage would be straightforward, a road that led where it led. But roads in this country did not simply arrive. They arrived at something. He stood before the 3 judges, and behind him, at the required interval, Eurydice waited. The 3 did not look at him the way living men look at one another. They received him. Rhadamanthus, whose face held no expression that could be called severity or kindness, but only a kind of settled attention, turned his gaze toward the living man with the slight adjustment of a figure who has seen everything and is therefore surprised by nothing. Minos, to his right, remained very still. Ajax, to his left, held a ring of keys across his lap, and his hands rested on them without gripping. A soul had arrived. Not a common shade drifting in from the asphodel, not the grey, formless passage of one who had forgotten their name on the road. Orpheus stood before them as a living man, with blood still moving in him, with breath, with the specific gravity of the living, and behind him, at the precise required distance, a dead woman stood. Rhadamanthus spoke first, not a challenge, not an interrogation, simply a question, placed in the air between them the way a stone is placed on flat ground. He asked the man to account for his presence. Orpheus answered. He had answered this question before, in the deeper places, before the greater powers. He knew the shape of the answer now. He spoke of Eurydice, of the marriage that had lasted 3 days, of the snake in the grass, and the hue, and the sudden absence that no living thing is prepared for. He spoke of the music he had played on the way down, and what it had done, and the agreement that had been made. He held still as he spoke. He did not turn. Rhadamanthus listened. This was his gift and his function, the capacity to hear not the arrangement of the words, but the arrangement of the life behind them. He heard the grief in the man's accounting. He heard also the precise quality of the agreement that the woman would follow as far as the road led, provided the man kept his face forward. Minos said nothing for a time. Then he spoke, and what he said was not judgment but clarification. He named what was occurring. He said that the man was alive and the woman was dead, and the road they had walked together was not designed for this kind of passage. That the agreement had been made elsewhere, at another level of authority, and that the tribunal did not hold it. The agreement was real. The terms were real. The road between them was real. But the road ended here. The keys on Ajax's lap were not metaphorical. They were specific. He held the key to the dark road that descended, and the key to the grey fields, and the key to the plain beyond the stone where the grass stood tall in the warm light. 3 paths, 3 dispositions. The keys corresponded. Rhadamanthus turned his gaze to the place behind Orpheus, to Eurydice. She stood at the interval. 1 step back. Her footfall had stopped with his. She had been, for the length of this road, a presence without pronouncement, the softer sound, the lighter weight, the shade following the living man. But here she was visible to the judges in a way she had not been visible to the prophets and the shades along the road. Here she was fully received. Rhadamanthus considered her. He knew her. Not as an individual case, though he knew the individual case as well. He knew her as the judges know all who come before them, as a life condensed into its essential character, stripped of everything the living world adds and subtracts, down to what the life had actually been. He saw her 3 days of marriage. He saw the meadow. He saw the snake. He saw the long grey distance of the asphodel and the road she had walked behind the musician without once breaking the interval. Without once moving ahead or falling back, he saw the moment on the road when the ocean sound had reached her. When something in her that had been very quiet had received it, he looked at Minos. Minos gave a slight inclination of the head. Ajax lifted the key that corresponded to the plane. This was the turning, not a dramatic gesture, not a proclamation sent across the distances of the underworld. A key lifted from a lap, a motion so small that the grass in the fields nearby continued its slow movement without noting it, and the ocean continued its patient address to the air. And Tiresias on his stone at the margin of the road felt nothing change in the quality of the sound around him, but the thing that changed was irrevocable. Rhadamanthus spoke again, and this time he addressed Eurydice directly. He told her she had been measured. He told her the plain was open to her, that the warmth ahead was hers, that the grass and the ocean sound and the long undisturbed afternoon were the correct destination for what she was. And then he addressed Orpheus. His voice did not alter. Rhadamanthus did not speak with cruelty, and he did not speak with consolation. He spoke with the precision of one who understands that the living and the dead occupy different countries, and that a living man cannot follow a dead woman through the key that Ajax had just lifted, regardless of the agreement or the music or the grief. The road, for Orpheus, ended at the stone platform. He could hear Eurydice behind him. He could hear her footfall, still at the required interval, still the soft, nearly absent sound that had been his sole company for the whole of the walk back through the grey country. He could hear it. He could not turn and look at her, because the terms of the agreement remained in force, and because some part of him understood. Without yet understanding what the key being lifted meant, Eurydice took one step forward, past the interval, past the one-step distance she had maintained from the first moment of the road. She moved past Orpheus, and her footfall for that one step was close enough that he could feel the displacement of it, the barely there pressure of a dead woman passing a living man at a threshold. Then she was ahead of him. She crossed the platform. She moved past the 3 judges, who received her passage without comment. And the plain ahead, with its warm settled light and its tall grass and the ocean sound embedded in its fabric, opened to her as a hand opens to receive something it has been waiting to hold. Orpheus remained on the road. The keys settled back across Ajax's lap. Minos returned to his stillness. Rhadamanthus turned his gaze to the space that was already filling with the next arrival, another soul approaching through the grey country, coming up the road with its particular accounting, its particular weight. The playing continued. The grass moved in the wind from the water. The light resided over everything. And somewhere in the wide expanse of the Elysian plain, a woman who had been dead for 3 days and had spent the whole of her death walking a grey road at the required interval, now walked without requirement. At her own pace, through the warm grass that held the light, the plain received her the way still water receives light, not with commotion, not with ceremony. The grass parted around her footsteps and closed again behind her, and the warm air moved across her face without demand, and she understood. In the way that understanding sometimes arrives, not as thought, but as the body's own recognition, that nothing here required her to be anything other than what she was. She had no name for what she felt. She had been 3 days dead, and had spent those 3 days in the grey country, moving through air that asked nothing of her, beside shades that noticed nothing about her. And now the air had changed. It held warmth without source, the kind of warmth that belongs to late afternoon on a hillside where nothing presses and nothing waits, and the light simply continues its residence over the land. She walked further into the grass. The ocean sound grew more present as she moved. not louder, more populated somehow, as if the sound had always contained within it the voices of the place, and she was only now close enough to hear them resolve into their full character. The grass was tall, it moved with the passage of air from the water, and the movement had a rhythm to it, unhurried and complete in itself. This was the Elysian plain. But the plain, as it was known to those who had studied the patterns of the underworld from the upper air, extended further than its first appearance suggested. Beyond the wide meadow fields, beyond the margin where the grass gave way to a different quality of ground that held, in its soil, a faint luminescence, as if something deeply patient had taken up residence in it long ago, there was another country. The ancients called it the Isle of the Blessed. Pindar had written of it. His words, composed for living men who needed to understand what virtue accumulated across lifetimes might achieve, described a place where the just lived without tears, where the ocean breezes moved through golden flowers, where the rule belonged to one who had himself been weighed by time and found, after long account, to be something that the world could not hold in punishment forever. That one was Cronus. Not the Cronus of the war, not the Titan who had swallowed his children and ruled the age before Zeus drew the order of things into its present shape. What dwelt on the Isle of the Blessed was a figure translated by time into its most essential aspect, the part that had preceded the fear and the violence, the part that belonged to the age of gold when the world had first been young, and the earth had given its abundance freely, and the air had been exactly as it was here, unhurried. Warm, full of the sound of water, Cronus had been released from Tartarus. The accounts did not agree on precisely when, or precisely how, except that Zeus had considered the matter and had understood that punishment and governance were different instruments, and that the Isle of the Blessed required the latter. A ruler for the realm of souls who had earned the deepest rest. A figure whose authority over those souls would come not from law or force, but from a quality of presence that had outlasted everything that had once made him terrible. He sat at the center of the isle in the way that certain very old things simply occupy space, without performance, without attention to themselves. The golden flowers that Pindar described grew in the ground around him and along the margins of the shore, where the breezes of Oceanus moved in off the water and turned the petals slowly on their stems. The breezes were constant here, not the grey, unchanging stillness of the asphodel, not the damp cold of the descending road. These were the winds that Homer's messenger had named, Zephyrus, the west wind, breathing across the plain with the specific gentleness of something that has never had reason to become otherwise. No snow came here. No cold wind, no rain in the heavy sense of rain that the living know, the rain that drives and chills and reminds the body of its exposure. What fell here, when anything fell, was dew. It arrived in the hours before the light strengthened and sat in small clear weight on the grass blades and on the golden petals, and by the time the warmth had settled fully over the plain it had been absorbed. And nothing remained of it except that everything it had touched was a degree more vivid. The souls who walked this ground were the ones Pindar had described as thrice virtuous. Those who had lived well not once but across the accumulation of incarnations, who had drunk from the river Mnemosyne before each returned to life and carried forward, in whatever vessel their next life gave them, something of the quality they had been. Not all souls reached the isle by that passage. Some came as heroes of a single life, great and unrepeatable, sent here by the weight of what they had done and what they had endured, but those who arrived through the 3 lives received it differently. They arrived already knowing. They had not forgotten what they were because Mnemosyne had kept the account. And so, when they crossed from the wider plain onto the luminous ground of the isle, there was in them a quality of arrival that the other souls did not quite have. A recognition, as if the place confirmed what they had long suspected, that the warmth they had felt in certain moments across their lives had been an intimation of this. Rhadamanthus came here too, in the long intervals between souls arriving at the tribunal. His duty resided at the judgment stone, but his nature resided here, in the place where justice had fulfilled itself and could be set down. He had been, in his life on Crete, a maker of laws, and he understood better than most that law was not the destination. Law was the road. What the road led to, if it was followed with honesty and care across a sufficient span of time, was this: the warm air, the golden flowers, the unhurried presence of old Cronus on his seat at the centre of the aisle, tending to nothing, requiring nothing, simply present in the manner of something that has arrived at the end of its long account with time. Eurydice had not yet reached the aisle. She was still in the wider plain, still close enough to the tribunal stone that the grey quality of the asphodel was audible somewhere behind her, not a sound exactly, but as the absence of this warmth, the contrast that made the warmth comprehensible. She stood in the tall grass and felt the air move from the water across her face. The ocean sound was very clear now. She could hear in it a texture she had not been able to name on the road when it had first reached her, and something in her had gone quiet to receive it. What she heard was not just the movement of water. It was the sound of a place that had been inhabited for an extremely long time by the presence of ease. The way a room where someone has slept soundly for many years carries in its silence a particular quality of rest. The grass moved around her. The light continued its patient residence. Somewhere further across the plain, where the ground began to hold its faint luminescence and the golden flowers grew along the shore, the breezes of Oceanus moved through the petals in their slow, specific turning, and Cronus remained at the centre of what his long life and long punishment had finally become, a sovereignty with nothing left to fear, tending the souls of the most fortunate dead in a country of perpetual zephyrus and warm, unhurried afternoon. Eurydice took another step into the grass. The light caught the movement of her passage through it, briefly, as a field shows the trail of something that has moved through it, and then resumed its full, even presence over the plain, and the grass stood again in its ordinary, undisturbed attendance, and the only evidence of her crossing was the warmth she moved through, which opened ahead of her without limit, holding everything it had always held, neither adding nor subtracting, simply there. The disturbance came from the other direction, not from the aisle, not from the direction of the ocean sound, but from somewhere behind and to the left of where Eurydice stood in the grass. A weight of movement, the kind that belonged to something large, something alive, something that had no business being here. She turned. Heracles came through the Elysian plain the way a stone comes through still water. Not violent exactly, but displacing. The grass parted before him in a wide radius. The warm light fell on him and found, perhaps for the first time in all its long residence over this ground, something that pushed back against it. He was breathing. This was the fact that the plain received with the greatest difficulty. He was breathing, and the breath moved in and out of him with the specific quality of effort, of exertion recently completed, of a body that had been in serious use. He was alive. The souls in the wider plain did not approach him. They moved in their own unhurried arcs across the grass in the warm afternoon, as they always did. And they did not stop or stare in the manner of the living, because they had left that quality behind with the weight of their former bodies, but they were aware of him. There was in the plain a faint adjustment, a subtle reorientation, the way a field of grain turns its collective face toward an unfamiliar wind. Heracles carried the lion skin across one shoulder. The club was in his right hand, though he held it without threat, almost without intention, the way a man who has carried something for a long time holds it without thinking. His eyes moved across the plain. He had come from the judgment stone, from the deep rows where the tribunal sat, and before that from the descent, from Cerberus, from the grey shores of the Styx and the coin in his mouth, and the long dark road that no living man was meant to walk. He had walked it anyway. This was consistent with his character. He was looking for something. His eyes swept the plain with the specific attention of a man who is used to finding things by force, and has not yet understood that here force was not the instrument required. Rhadamanthus found him before long. The judge had been walking along the margin of the aisle. In the interval he allowed himself between the work of the tribunal and the slow restoration that this place provided. He saw Heracles from a distance and stopped. He stood there for a moment in the warm grass, and something moved across his face that was not quite surprise. He had known, in the way that judges know the shape of events that have been set in motion by forces larger than themselves, that a living man would come here. He had not known it would be this particular morning, but morning in Elysium was not a precise category, and he had not been troubled by the uncertainty. He walked toward Heracles. They stood together at some distance from the isle's luminous margin, in the wide grass where the light was warm and even, and the ocean sound moved through the air with its constant, layered texture. Heracles said, "I have come for the dog." Rhadamanthus looked at him for a long moment. He did not answer immediately. He had the judge's habit of allowing space before speech, of not filling silence with unnecessary content. He said, "You have passed through this plain to reach what lies below it. You have seen what is here." Heracles looked at the plain around him. He looked at it the way a man looks at something when he is being asked to look, when someone has directed his attention to a thing he might otherwise have moved past. The grass, the warm, sourceless light, the unhurried passage of the souls through the afternoon, each one moving with the specific ease of something that has set down every weight it carried. He had moved through it quickly on his way down. He had not set down his club. He had not stopped to feel the air or to listen to the ocean that came to him from somewhere beyond the luminous ground. He was feeling it now. Rhadamanthus said nothing more. He had made his point with precision. The quality of the light here was different from what Heracles had known on the road of descent. On that road the dark had been a presence, actual and pressing. Here the light did not press. It rested. It occupied the air without demanding acknowledgment, without requiring that the things it touched perform any particular response. Heracles stood in it and felt something that 12 labours had not required him to feel, which was the specific quality of rest that exists only in places from which all urgency has been removed. He was not resting. He was aware, precisely, of not resting, of the continued readiness in his body, the readiness that had not left him since before he could remember, but he could feel in the air around him what rest was. He could feel its shape the way a man who has never been warm can feel, standing near a fire, the outline of what warmth is. The dead man he encountered next had been a king. In Aetolia, in a life that had ended young, Meleager. He stood in the grass some distance from where Heracles and Rhadamanthus had spoken, near the margin of the wider plain, and he turned when Heracles approached. There was recognition between them. Not of the ordinary kind. Meleager had been dead for longer than Heracles had been alive. But the underworld has its own form of acquaintance, and the souls of the Elysian plain carried the full account of what they had been, and Meleager had been present. In story and in the telling of story, in the lives of the heroic dead, long enough to know Heracles by his outline. They stood together in the grass, and Meleager spoke. He spoke of the plain, of what it was to have come here, to have passed through the judgment and found oneself in this specific warmth. He did not speak with grief, or with longing, or with the quality of someone reviewing loss. He spoke with the even, unhurried tone of someone describing a place they know well, the way a man describes his own village to a stranger, pointing out the features that are most worth noticing. He told Heracles about the dew that came before the light strengthened, and about the way the ocean sound accumulated as one moved toward the isle, and about the golden flowers along the shore that Pindar had written of, and about the manner in which the souls who had arrived by way of 3 lives moved differently from those who had come through a single great span. Heracles listened. He had not, in his life, been a good listener. He had been a man of action, of forward movement, of problems solved through the application of considerable force. But something in the plain made listening easier. The air had that quality. It did not push. And so the words of Meleager came to him and settled, and he received them with more attention than he had given to most things. When Meleager finished, Heracles stood in the warm light for a while. Then he nodded. He picked up his club from where he had set it. Briefly, at his feet, he adjusted the lion skin. He looked once more toward the isle, where the faint luminescence of the ground showed clearly now in the long, warm afternoon, and where the golden flowers moved in the Zephyrus with their slow, specific turning, and where Cronus sat at the centre of his unwilled and unhurried sovereignty. He turned away from it and began walking back toward the deep roads. The grass closed behind him. The light resumed its full, even presence over the plain, and the ocean sound continued its long, inhabited texture. And Meleager remained in the warm afternoon, standing still in the grass, watching the point where the living man had been until the grass was simply grass again, and the warmth was simply warmth, and there was nothing in the plain to indicate that something extraordinary had passed through it, except the particular quality of the silence it had left behind, which sat in the air for a while, and then was absorbed, the way dew is absorbed, leaving everything it had touched a degree more vivid than before. The plain did not mark his departure with any visible change. The grass returned to its undisturbed state. The light continued at its usual sourceless depth. The ocean sound moved through the air with the same layered texture it had held for longer than the oldest souls on the plain could account for. Cronus remained at the centre of the isle. He had been there since before Rhadamanthus arrived. Before the first souls found their way down the deep roads and through the judgment and across the asphodel fields to stand at the margin of the brighter country. He had been there before the golden flowers grew along the shore, or perhaps the flowers had grown because he was there. Drawing something up through the luminous ground from whatever source of the world's first warmth he still carried in himself, this was the thing that made the isle different from the rest of Elysium. The plain was peaceful. The isle was reconciled. There was a distance between those two states that most visitors could not name, but every soul who crossed from one to the other felt at once. In the way a man stepping from open air into a walled garden feels the air change without being able to say what specifically changed. The peace of the plain came from the absence of difficulty. The reconciliation of the isle came from something that had passed through difficulty and arrived somewhere beyond it. That was not the same thing. And Cronus knew the difference with a thoroughness no other inhabitant of this country possessed. He had not always been here. The Titanomachy ended, and the world was divided, and Cronus had descended into Tartarus the way a stone descends into deep water, not gradually. Without discussion. He had been the lord of the Golden Age, the ruler before all rulers, the figure under whose long sovereignty the fields had given their grain without being asked, and the earth had offered its fruit without effort. His reign was the myth that justified the idea that things had once been better, that before the complications of the present arrangement, before the thunder and the negotiations and the accumulated grievances of the divine families, there had been a time of uncomplicated abundance. Then it ended. The war with the Olympians was not a single event. It accumulated over years, as such wars do, through individual confrontations and retreats, and the slow erosion of ground held too long without reinforcement. The Titans were powerful. Their power was old, and old power has a kind of density to it, a resistance to change that is not the same as strength, but is often mistaken for it in the early phases of a conflict. Cronus had held his throne against the pressure from below for longer than the new gods expected, but he had held it through containment, through the swallowing of children, through the management of what he feared rather than through the addressing of it. That was the error. Not the cruelty of it, though the cruelty was real. The error was structural. He had believed that holding something down was the same as resolving it. He had believed that what he swallowed could not reassemble itself inside him and find its way back to light. He was wrong about that in a manner that was irreversible by the time he understood it. Tartarus held him for a long time. The exact duration is not a question Elysium concerns itself with. Time in Tartarus does not accumulate in the manner of ordinary time. There is no dew to mark the morning, and no lengthening of light to mark the afternoon. There is only the sentence, pressing from every direction at once, and the knowledge of what was lost, and the specific quality of understanding that arrives only when there is absolutely nothing else to attend to. He understood, in Tartarus, what he had done and why, and what it had cost the world and what it had cost himself. He understood the fear that had driven him and the limitations of what fear produces when it governs a power that was never meant to be governed by it. He understood these things not in the way one understands an argument, but in the way one understands cold, fully, and in the body, without the possibility of maintaining any intellectual distance from the fact. When Zeus released him, there was no ceremony. This was the detail that the surviving accounts of that event tended to elide, because ceremony was easier to describe. But what actually happened was quieter than any ceremony would have been. Zeus came to the boundary of Tartarus and spoke to his father through the dark, and what he said was not elaborate. It was a judgment, considered over the long course of the new order's consolidation, delivered when enough time had passed for it to mean what Zeus intended it to mean, rather than what fear or resentment might have made it mean earlier. He said that the punishment was complete. He said that what Cronus was being offered was not forgiveness exactly, but a function. A place where the weight of his old understanding could be put to use, rather than continue to press against the walls of Tartarus with nowhere to go. The Isle of the Blessed. Cronus had walked up out of the dark and across the intervening ground and onto the luminous shore, and the golden flowers were there. And the Oceanus breezes moved through them, and the warmth of the place came up through the soles of his feet, and he stood in it, and did not speak for a long time. He was king here in the specific sense that his presence organized the place around itself, not through command, not through the exercise of power as he had once exercised it. The isle did not require governance in the ordinary sense. The souls who came here had already been judged. They had already completed the long arc of their becoming. They did not need to be ruled. What they needed, and what Cronus provided without intending to, was something harder to name. A centre, a gravity. The particular quality of repose that belongs to something which has been tested by its worst failure and has come through to the other side of it, and sits now without defensiveness, without the coiled readiness that had defined his first reign. In the warm light, Rhadamanthus understood this about him. He had arrived at the isle's margin many years before Cronus, and had spent considerable time considering what the place needed and what he could provide. He was a lawgiver by nature and by practice. A man who had spent his mortal life on Crete constructing the structures by which communities could trust one another across the distance of their individual self-interests. He had come to the underworld with that understanding intact, sharpened by his passage through the judgment. And he had recognized immediately that what the isle required from him was different from what the plain required. The plain required adjudication. The isle required witness. He watched Cronus the way a careful judge watches a case he did not expect to find instructive. There was the fallen Titan, the original ruler, the architect of the Golden Age and the author of its ending, sitting at the center of the isle's luminous ground, with the golden flowers at his feet and the Oceanus wind moving through his stillness. And the tension in that figure, the unresolved conflict between what Cronus had been and what he was now, between the Lord who had swallowed his children and the quiet presence who held the center of paradise without apparent effort, was the thing that Rhadamanthus had been observing and reconsidering for longer than he could calculate. The reconciliation was real, he did not doubt that, But it was not complete. Completeness was not the condition of the isle. The condition of the isle was that the incompleteness of things was held without urgency, the way the light here held the afternoon without pressing it toward evening. Cronus sat in the warm centre of the isle, and the old unresolved account of what he had done and what had been done to him by consequence remained in him the way the ocean sound remained in the air of the plain, present, layered, never quite arriving and never quite departing. The golden flowers turned in the Zephyrus. The light held its even depth over the isle and over the wider plain beyond, and the souls moved in their unhurried arcs through the long afternoon, and the warmth rose from the luminous ground with the patient constancy of something that had been doing exactly this for longer than the oldest myth. Among the souls who moved through the wider plain, two came to the isle in the same long afternoon, arriving from separate directions and by separate paths, as if the isle had drawn them without consultation. Achilles came first. He had spent a considerable time on the plain itself before the isle claimed him. The Elysian fields had received him as they received all who came there, without fanfare, without the particular ceremony that his mortal life had accumulated around itself like sediment. The heroes of the plain had recognized him. They had made room for him in the unhurried way of that place, stepping slightly aside, not in deference exactly, but in the simple acknowledgment that his passage through the door of death had been a passage of particular cost. He had been a long time learning what that meant here, on the plain. The striving that had defined him fell away by increments rather than all at once. Each increment was small and noticeable. There was the morning, if morning was the right word for the way the light deepened and clarified on the plain, when he had stood at the edge of the golden meadow and understood that there was nothing left to prove. Not because the question had been answered, but because the question had stopped being the right question. The weight of it, the old heaviness of needing to matter in a way that could be measured, had simply set itself down somewhere behind him, and he had walked on without picking it up again. Patroclus was already there. This was the thing the isle held that the plain's outer reaches could not have held, because it required a particular quality of received grief to prepare for it. Patroclus was standing near the water's margin, where the Oceanus breezes came through most clearly, and he turned when Achilles reached the shore, and neither of them said anything for a long time. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of everything the living years had held, the campaigns and the arguments and the long evenings of the war and the one terrible morning at the wall of Troy. And it held all of that without any of it pressing forward to be addressed. On the plain, Achilles had learned that grief did not disappear here. It became something you carried differently, distributed across the whole body rather than concentrated at a single point. The isle sharpened this understanding further. Grief here was not a wound. It was a record. It said, this mattered. This still matters, but it no longer cuts. Patroclus touched his arm. That was all. Ajax came in the afternoon from the direction of the plain's quieter reaches. He moved across the luminous ground with the slow deliberateness that had always characterized him, the walk of a man built to hold his position rather than advance it. And he came to where Achilles and Patroclus stood with them, and looked out at the Oceanus water. There was a history between Ajax and Achilles that had not been simple. The armour had been between them. The judgment of the Greeks at Troy, the decision that had gone to Odysseus rather than to Ajax, the madness that followed, and the ending that followed the madness. These things had been true once. They remained true here in the sense that the record did not revise itself. The isle did not offer a cleaned version of what had happened. What it offered was different. Ajax stood beside Achilles, and the old grievance, which had never been Ajax's grievance against Achilles directly, but which had accumulated something of Achilles in it by proximity, sat between them as a known thing. Not denied, not reopened. Known. Achilles spoke first. He said that he had not asked for the armour to be given to him. Ajax said that he knew. This exchange was not a reconciliation in any dramatic sense. It was more like the setting of a table, an acknowledgement that they were in the same place and that the place required them to be present to each other without the old business standing between them like an obstacle. Ajax had passed through his own long process on the plain. The madness and the shame had been looked at squarely, turned over, understood as the consequence of a suffering that had been real even when its expression had been terrible. He was not the same figure who had fallen on his own sword outside the walls of Troy. Neither was Achilles the same figure who had raged against Agamemnon and allowed the war to break apart around his refusal. The isle did not make men smaller versions of themselves. It made them the versions of themselves that the living years had been reaching toward without quite arriving. Patroclus sat down on the shore. After a time Achilles sat beside him. Then Ajax. The three of them sat facing the Oceanus water, and the breezes moved through them with the same patience they moved through the golden flowers, and the light held its even depth above them, and the sound of the water was present in the way it was always present on the isle, layered, sourceless, arriving without beginning. Rhadamanthus saw them from his place near the isle's inland rise. He did not approach. The isle's logic did not require his presence in every moment. His witness was a patient occupation. He observed the three figures sitting at the water's margin, and he recognized in their arrangement something he had watched before in different forms. The particular configuration of people who have come through separate difficulties to arrive at a shared stillness, not agreement necessarily. Not the resolution of all differences, but the recognition that the differences, which had been so sharp in the living world, had been filed smooth by the passage through death and judgment and arrival. Cronus watched from the centre. His awareness of the isle extended in all directions without effort, not as surveillance, but as the natural extension of his presence through the ground he occupied. He knew the three heroes were there. He knew their names and what those names meant in the larger account of the mortal world. He had ruled during the age before their age, and the Golden Age's ending had made their age possible, and they were here now. The children of that consequence, sitting at the margin of his sea. There was something in this he held without examining too closely. The afternoon moved in its unhurried way around the isle and the plain beyond it. The golden flowers turned against the Zephyrus. Achilles sat with Patroclus and Ajax on the luminous shore, and the Oceanus sound continued its layered movement through the warm air, and Rhadamanthus remained at his inland post, and Cronus remained at the centre. And the even light neither deepened nor retreated, but held the whole of it in the same clear, patient depth that it had held since the first soul arrived here and understood in the body that this was where the long arc had been pointing all along. The afternoon had not moved on. It continued to hold the isle in the same even-handed light, and the three figures at the water's margin continued to sit in the posture of men who had nowhere else to be, and had understood this fully. Then, from the direction of the plain, something shifted. Rhadamanthus sensed it before he saw it. Not a disturbance precisely, more like a change in the quality of what was arriving. Most souls came to the isle having passed through the plain over a long period, their movement gradual, the distance shrinking almost without their noticing until the isle simply became where they were. This was different. What approached across the plain carried a kind of deliberateness with it. Not the deliberateness of Ajax, which had been the deliberateness of a man who had walked a long, difficult road. This was the deliberateness of a man who had been told where he was going and had believed it, and had nevertheless spent many years doubting that belief, and was now arriving to find it true. Menelaus came across the golden plain in the afternoon light. He was not dead. This was the unusual thing, the thing that the isle accommodated without ceremony, as it accommodated everything, but which nevertheless carried its own weight. The prophecy of Proteus had named him, had said that the gods would carry him to the Elysian plain because of who he was and whose daughter he had married, and the prophecy had been true. He had not died at the end of the long Trojan years. He had not died in the long wandering home, through Egypt, through the winds that would not release him, through the slow return to Sparta. He had lived out his years there beside Helen, in the ordinary accumulation of days that follow extraordinary events, and then the gods had taken him without requiring him to pass through the common darkness. He had come the other way. He was a mortal man made immortal by marriage and by the decision of Zeus. He carried this lightly. It had never felt entirely like something he had earned. Rhadamanthus watched him cross the plain and descend toward the isle. There was a particular quality of arrival that Rhadamanthus had learned to read over the long occupation of his witnessing. Some souls arrived already at peace. Some arrived still carrying the full freight of their living years, needing the plain's long grasses to work on them. Menelaus arrived in a third condition. He arrived like a man who had made his peace with most things, but who held one old uncertainty in the center of his chest. A question about whether his presence here was earned or given. Rhadamanthus left the inland rise. He came down across the luminous ground, unhurried, meeting the arriving man at the shore's edge, where the Oceanus breezes moved most freely. They stood facing each other in the even light. Menelaus looked at the isle around him. He looked at the golden flowers moving against the Zephyrus on the plain he had just crossed. He looked at the Oceanus water and at the three figures sitting at the far end of the shore, whom he did not yet recognize, but who carried in their postures a peace that he found difficult to look at directly. He said, "I was not sure this would be real." Rhadamanthus did not say that everything was real. He said, "It is." There was something in this exchange that Menelaus needed, not a judgment exactly. He had already been judged in the larger sense. Proteus had seen what Zeus had decided, and the decision had been made before Menelaus's final day came. But there is a difference between being told that a place exists and standing in it, and Menelaus had lived for many years in the gap between those two things. He had told himself that the prophecy was true. He had believed it most days, and then he was here, and Rhadamanthus was in front of him, and the place was exactly what it had been described to be. Not larger, not smaller. Precise. The breezes moved through him. He had expected to feel something enormous. What he felt was quiet. Not empty, but very quiet. The way a room feels after a long argument has finally ended, and the people inside it have decided to stop speaking and simply be in the same place without words. Rhadamanthus walked with him along the shore. He did not explain the isle. He did not catalogue its rules or its geography. He simply walked beside the man who had been promised this place and had now arrived, and the walking was itself a kind of reception. The Oceanus sound moved around them, layered, sourceless. The golden flowers on the plain turned with the Zephyrus at a distance. The light held its even depth above the water. At the far end of the shore, Achilles looked up. He recognized Menelaus across the distance and sat with this recognition without moving. They had been at Troy together. They had fought the same war from different positions inside it. Menelaus had been the reason for the war, or rather Helen had been the reason, and Menelaus had been the occasion, and the distinction had never been simple. 10 years of war are difficult to reduce to a single cause or a single face, but Menelaus had held his place in it. He had fought. He had not been the greatest among the Greeks, but he had not been absent either. Patroclus saw Achilles look up and followed his gaze. Ajax did not look for a moment. Then he did. The three of them watched Rhadamanthus walk with Menelaus along the luminous shore. The afternoon light covered all of it with its usual evenness. Nothing was dramatized. The isle did not make ceremonies of arrivals. What it made was room. Menelaus came to where the three heroes sat. He stood before them, and they sat before him, and there was a long moment in which no one spoke, and the Oceanus sound moved through the silence, the way it moved through everything here, filling without crowding. The war was between all of them in the way the war was between all who had been at Troy, not as a wound any more, as a shared fact, something they had all been inside, and which had brought them each to their separate ends, and which had led, by the long routes of their individual histories, to this afternoon on this shore. In this light, Achilles said his name. Menelaus said his. Patroclus moved along the shore and made room, and Menelaus sat down on the luminous ground beside them, and Rhadamanthus stood at a little distance with the same patient watching he always maintained, and the Oceanus breezes came through at the water's margin, and the 4 men who had each been shaped by Troy and had each been carried here by the consequence of that shaping sat together without needing anything from each other beyond the simple acknowledgment that they were present. Cronus felt the addition from the centre of the isle, one more name in the ground he occupied. One more completed arc. The man who had been promised the plain had arrived at the plain, and the plain had received him as it received everyone, without revision, without fanfare. With only the even light and the layered sound and the breezes that did not stop and would not stop, moving through the golden flowers and the still figures of the blessed, with the same unhurrying patience that Zephyrus had breathed across this place, since the first hero looked up from the plain's long grasses and saw the shore and understood that his wandering was finished. Rhadamanthus turned from the group after a while and walked back along the shore in the direction from which he had come, not because his presence was no longer needed, but because presence and distance were both instruments he used with the same deliberate care. He had learned, in the long practice of this place, that some things settled better without observation. The 4 men on the shore were not fragments of a conversation requiring management. They were complete things finding their arrangement. He left them to it and moved along the water's margin, where the Oceanus breezes gathered in small layered currents against his ankles. From the centre of the isle, Cronus noted the shift. He had always been precise about distance. It was an old habit, built into him from before the Titanomachy, from before the long imprisonment, from before any of the arrangements that had eventually placed him here at the heart of this golden and unhurrying island. Distance was not coldness. It was attention of a particular kind. The ruler of the isle did not walk among the blessed frequently, but his awareness extended through the ground beneath them and the breezes above them with a steadiness that had nothing effortful in it. Rhadamanthus approached the centre. This was itself unusual. The judge did not often leave the shore unmarked by reason. When he moved inland, Cronus registered it as deliberate. The older figure watched the younger approach across the plain's long grasses, through the golden flowers that turned with the Zephyrus on all sides. And Rhadamanthus walked with the same unhurried step he used at the water's edge. Nothing in his bearing carried urgency. What it carried was intention. He came to where Cronus sat and stood at a respectful distance. Not far, not close. Correctly placed, the way things tended to be correctly placed on the isle, as though the ground itself organized proximity according to some prior agreement. Cronus said, "The Spartan king has come." Rhadamanthus confirmed it. There was a pause in which the Zephyrus moved through the grasses between them. The golden flowers on the near slope of the plain dipped and recovered. The afternoon light maintained its depth. None of this was commentary. The isle did not editorialize, but there was a quality in the silence that both of them occupied with ease. The way 2 figures who have occupied the same territory for a long time learn to share its silences without filling them unnecessarily. Cronus had not been king here since the beginning. He had come to this place by the same mechanism of divine revision that governed so much of what happened between his family and himself. Zeus had removed him from Tartarus. The decision had not been made quickly, and the reasoning behind it was not something Cronus dwelled on. Reasons mattered before resolutions. After them they became simply the history of how things arrived at their present form. He was here. The isle was his to govern. Rhadamanthus presided over judgment. These were facts that had settled into place like stones into soil. The arrangement between them had not required negotiation. Cronus was a Titan, older than the Olympians, shaped by a different order of time and a different relationship to power. Rhadamanthus was the son of Zeus and a mortal woman, born into the world that had replaced the one Cronus had ruled. He had been a lawgiver on Crete before he was a judge here. He knew the particular difficulty of governing beings who believed their own exceptions. He had given that up when he came to the Isle, and found that the work here was simpler in one sense and more demanding in another. Simpler because the souls who arrived had already been found worthy. More demanding because worthiness did not mean the absence of history. And the histories that arrived with the blessed were long and complicated and required a particular quality of reception. Cronus understood this without being told. He had governed before. He knew that rulers and judges were not the same office, and that the distance between them was not rivalry but differentiation. He had been a king. He had not been a judge, not in the sense Rhadamanthus was. He had made decisions based on what he could see and calculate. Rhadamanthus made them based on what was true beneath the visible layer. It was a distinction Cronus respected. He said, "The ones from Troy have settled." Rhadamanthus said yes. Cronus looked past him toward the shore, not seeing it directly at this distance, but knowing it was there and knowing what it held. Achilles, Patroclus, Ajax, and now Menelaus, sitting among them with the shared silence of men who had been bound by the same catastrophe and had each found their separate way to this island at the world's far edge. The war had made them contemporaries. The isle had made them something else. Neighbours, perhaps, in the oldest sense of the word. People occupying adjacent ground over time. He said, the living man was not troubled when he arrived. Rhadamanthus considered this. He said, he was uncertain, not troubled. There is a difference. Cronus accepted the distinction. He had lived through uncertainty that became trouble, and uncertainty that became clarity. The Spartan king had clearly experienced the second kind. He had arrived with the question still in his face, and the isle had answered it by existing precisely as described. Nothing more was required. Between the two of them, the Zephyrus moved with its usual patient persistence. The grasses bent and straightened. The golden flowers did their quiet work of being present in the afternoon light, catching and releasing the breeze with a fidelity that had no explanation beyond their nature. Rhadamanthus said, "There are others still to come." It was not an announcement. It was simply a statement about the ongoing state of things. The isle received. It continued to receive, not as a function of obligation, but as a function of what it was. Cronus said, "There are always others still to come." The two of them stood together in the late afternoon of the isle that had no late afternoon, only this one, maintained without diminishment across all the hours that the Zephyrus breathed, and the blessed souls occupied their ease along the shore. Rhadamanthus would return to the water's margin when the time came. Cronus would remain at the centre, where the isle's deep sense of itself gathered around him like the roots of an old tree beneath undisturbed ground. This was the arrangement. It held without effort. On the shore, Menelaus sat among the three heroes, and the Oceanus sound moved around all of them, filling the spaces between words neither spoken nor needed, and the afternoon held everything in the same, even and uncrowding light it had always held. The same light that had received Achilles, and would receive others after Menelaus, each of them arriving at the plain's edge with their own long history, and then walking down to the shore and finding, to their surprise or to their relief, that the place was exactly what it had been promised to be. Rhadamanthus looked back once from where he stood beside Cronus. The shore, the heroes, the breezes. He turned back to the centre of the isle and stood quietly beside the king of this place, and neither of them spoke again for a long while. and the golden flowers on the nearby slope moved in the Zephyrus with a slow and irreducible persistence, and the sound of the Oceanus carried up from the shore the way sound carries across open ground in the absence of everything that might disturb it. The Zephyrus moved through the long grasses of the central plain in slow, undulating lines. It was not a wind that announced itself. It simply moved, passing through everything on the isle with the same unhurried continuity it had maintained since the first souls arrived, and found the place already as described, already complete, already breathing. Rhadamanthus walked back toward the shore. His path took him down from the central rise where Cronus remained, through the middle ground of the plain where the grasses grew tallest and the golden flowers clustered most thickly along the low ridges of the slope. He walked without urgency. The isle had never required urgency from anyone who moved across it, and he had long since ceased to carry that particular habit forward from his years on Crete. The urgency of law, the urgency of governance, the pressing forward of men who believed their disputes could not hold a moment longer, none of it had followed him here. He had set it down somewhere on the path between one life and this one, and had not missed it. The flowers on either side of him moved as he passed. Not toward him, not in response to his presence, simply moving as the Zephyrus directed, dipping and recovering with the same small persistence they gave to everything else. The four of them were still there. Achilles sat nearest the water, his posture easy in a way it had never been during his life, the long tension of a warrior's readiness entirely gone from his shoulders. Patroclus sat beside him at no particular distance, simply near, as men sit who have been near each other long enough that proximity no longer requires reason. Ajax occupied a stretch of ground slightly apart, not isolated but separate in the manner of a man who had always carried more space around him than others. A vastness of frame and presence that continued here without diminishment, but also without the weight it had carried during his life. Menelaus sat at the edge of their loosely formed group. He was not yet inside it, not yet outside it. He occupied the threshold that newly arrived souls occupied for a while before the isle's particular quality of duration settled over them. He was watching the water, not searching it, not reading it for weather or tide or the position of enemy ships, only watching it. The Oceanus stretched away from the shore in its enormous, unhurried width, and the sound it made was steady. And Menelaus was learning that he did not need to do anything with that sound except receive it. Rhadamanthus reached the water's margin and stood at a distance from them. He had learned, through long practice, that the shore's work was done through presence rather than action. Souls newly arrived needed someone who knew the isle to be nearby, not to instruct them, but to demonstrate through posture and silence that demonstration through posture and silence was the correct response to this place. He stood and let the Oceanus sound move around him, the same way it moved around Menelaus and the three heroes, filling everything available to it without preference. Achilles said something low to Patroclus. The words did not carry to where Rhadamanthus stood. They were not meant to. They belonged to the two of them in the way that certain things had always belonged only to those two, and the isle had no mechanism for changing the nature of attachment, only for allowing it to rest in surroundings adequate to its depth. Patroclus turned briefly toward the water, then back. Ajax watched the exchange without expression, not indifferent, but settled, a man who had long known the measure of the bond between those two, and had never required it to include him. Menelaus did not watch them. He kept his attention on the water, but something in his shoulders had shifted slightly since Rhadamanthus had last observed him from the height of the plain. The uncertainty Rhadamanthus had identified on arrival, the question still present in the posture of a man who had spent decades on the far side of a prophecy waiting to understand what it meant, was no longer holding him at the same angle. The isle was working on him. Not dramatically, simply by being what it was and allowing him to be inside it long enough for the quality of the place to register in the way it registered in all those who arrived here. Rhadamanthus did not move closer. The Zephyrus came in from the west. It moved across the water first, visible as a slight change in the surface texture of the Oceanus, a darkening line that crossed toward shore and then passed onto the land. Pressing through the grasses at the margin, climbing up the slope of the plain toward the central rise where Cronus sat. The wind did not change its character as it moved. It carried nothing from one place to the other. It was simply the same wind in each location, constant in its mild, attending persistence. The golden flowers on the slope above the shore moved in it. Each one dipped forward, held for a moment at the fullest extension of the stem, then recovered to vertical. The motion repeated without fatigue across the whole face of the slope. Menelaus turned from the water. He looked at Achilles, who was still speaking quietly with Patroclus, and something crossed his face that was neither recognition nor greeting, but lay between them. He had known Achilles. He had known what it was to be in the presence of that particular force of human excellence directed entirely toward war. He had been on the same ground with him for 10 years, separated by the logistics of alliance and the hierarchies of command. He had never sat beside him like this. Had never had occasion to. The war had not permitted it. The distance between a king managing an alliance and a hero burning at the center of it had been too great for casual proximity. Here the distance was simply ground, crossable whenever either of them chose to cross it, or not crossed. Both were available. Ajax glanced toward Rhadamanthus. It was not a look that asked anything. It was the look of a man who had grown comfortable with the presence of someone who stood at the margin of his company without requiring anything of it. Rhadamanthus returned it with the same plainness. Ajax looked back toward the water. The Oceanus moved. The Zephyrus moved through the grasses behind Rhadamanthus where the slope began its rise. The afternoon light lay over everything in its deep, even way, neither strengthening nor fading, holding each surface in the same clear regard. Menelaus said something. The words were not directed at anyone in particular, and not directed at no one. They fell into the space the four of them occupied together, available to be received or let pass. Achilles turned from Patroclus. He looked at Menelaus for a moment with the calm attention of someone who had long since stopped measuring other men against the urgency of his own existence. Then he said something back. Short, without deliberation. The way men speak when they are not performing speech. Rhadamanthus did not hear the words. He did not need to. The exchange was not the kind that required witnesses. It was the first thread of something ordinary beginning to form between men who had shared a catastrophe from different distances and had arrived separately at the same shore. The isle received such threads the same way it received everything, without commentary, without acceleration. The Zephyrus pressed once more across the water. Its breath reached the shore grasses and turned them briefly silver, then passed upward. The golden flowers on the slope above recovered from each small bowing with the same unhurried reliability. And Rhadamanthus stood at the water's edge in the unchanged afternoon, present to all of it, requiring nothing further from the scene than what it was already quietly giving. The afternoon held its quality without variation. The light across the plain did not strengthen or diminish. The Oceanus continued its wide, unhurried presence along the shore, its sound neither rising nor falling, only persisting in the way of things that have no reason to stop. Rhadamanthus remained where he stood. He had watched many arrivals over the long course of his tenure on the isle. Each one had its own character. Some souls arrived with the stillness of those who had spent a long time expecting this place, and found it exactly as they had imagined. Others arrived carrying a residual alertness, the habit of wariness not yet dissolved, which the isle received without comment and simply waited on. Menelaus had arrived in the second manner. He was crossing now, gradually, into something that resembled the first. The thread that had formed between Menelaus and Achilles, that short, unwitnessed exchange, did not require anything further to be real. It had entered the fabric of what the isle held. That was sufficient. On the Elysian plain, beginnings did not need to announce themselves. They simply existed from the moment they occurred, and the isle carried them forward without assistance. Achilles had returned his attention to Patroclus. The two of them sat in the posture of men who had been beside each other long enough that sitting together required no adjustment. There was no performance in it. Patroclus said something low, and Achilles tilted his head slightly in the way of someone listening to a familiar voice. Whatever passed between them was unremarkable in the best sense, ordinary, the accumulated texture of a bond that had never needed to explain itself. Ajax sat apart from them, as he often did. His frame was vast, even in repose. He occupied his portion of the shore without filling it with agitation, the way certain large forms in nature, boulders at the edge of the sea. Old trees on a hillside occupy their space with a kind of inherent authority that demands nothing and requires no acknowledgement. He was watching the Oceanus. He had been watching it for some time. There was nothing to read in his expression except a settled familiarity with what he was seeing. As though the wide water had long since ceased to surprise him and had become instead a form of companionship, Menelaus was not watching the water now. He was watching Achilles and Patroclus, not with longing and not with the particular exhaustion of a man reflecting on what his own life had or had not contained. He was watching them the way a person watches something that is simply worth watching, the ease between them, the way they moved in proximity without friction or ceremony. He had known partnerships forged in war. He had known what it was to rely on other men completely, to have that reliance hold under conditions that stripped everything else away. He had not known what it looked like on the far side of all that. What it became when the striving was finished and only the companionship remained. The isle was showing him. Rhadamanthus observed this without moving toward it. His function here was not to direct attention or to instruct souls in what they were receiving. The place itself was the instruction. He was only present to confirm, with his unhurried attendance, that what was happening was being witnessed and therefore held. A second exchange passed between Achilles and Menelaus. Rhadamanthus was not close enough to hear this one either. Achilles had turned again toward Menelaus, not all the way, but enough. Menelaus had said something. Achilles responded. The exchange was longer than the first, several short statements passing back and forth with a quality that suggested neither man was testing the other. Neither was performing courtesy or managing distance. They were simply speaking. Two men on a shore, talking in the afternoon. Ajax's attention shifted, not dramatically. Just a small realignment of his posture, a slight inclination that suggested he had registered the exchange without requiring more of it. He did not turn toward them. He let the sounds of their conversation exist in the same space as the sound of the Oceanus, and gave neither more weight than the other. Patroclus leaned back slightly on his hands. He looked up at the sky above the plain, which held the same even light it had always held here, deep and clear, neither oppressive nor absent. The sky over the isle did not press down. It simply continued above, high and still, as the ground continued below. Patroclus seemed to find this agreeable. He remained in that position for a long time, his face turned upward, at ease in the particular way that belongs to those who have completely surrendered the habit of anticipating difficulty. The Zephyrus moved again across the plain. It came from the west as it always did, tracking its quiet line across the surface of the Oceanus before it reached the shore. The grasses at the water's margin bent in a slow, continuous wave as it passed through them. The golden flowers on the slope above took it in their stems, dipped forward in their unhurried way, and recovered. The wind moved up toward the central rise. On the rise, Cronus sat in the same position he had occupied throughout the afternoon. His stillness uninterrupted by the wind's arrival, the pale grasses around him moving against his fixed presence like water parting around a stone. Rhadamanthus watched the wind complete its passage. He had observed it countless times. The observation never became routine in the way that dulls attention. Each passage of the Zephyrus was identical in character and fresh in experience, which was one of the qualities the isle produced in those who dwelled here long enough to receive it fully. Repetition did not flatten. It deepened. On the shore below him, Achilles had moved. Not far. He had shifted his position so that the angle between himself and Menelaus was slightly more direct. Not facing him completely, but no longer angled away. Patroclus remained leaning back on his hands, aware of the shift without commenting on it. This too was a kind of knowing. The ease with which Patroclus held his own contentment, without requiring Achilles to account for his attention, that ease spoke of long practice, of a bond that had grown large enough to contain other connections without feeling diminished by them. Menelaus had straightened slightly. His posture had been softening since his arrival, and this was not a reversal of that. It was something different. The straightening of a man who has been received, who has registered, in some register below deliberate thought, that he is no longer on the outside of something, but has been quietly included in it. Not through formal invitation, but through the simple accumulation of time spent on the same ground, the Oceanus moved against the shore. The grasses stood and bent and stood again. Ajax did not turn from the water, but the line of his broad shoulders was, if anything, slightly more open than it had been. A small thing, the kind of shift that required an observer with Rhadamanthus's particular patience to notice. But it was present. The four of them remained on the shore in the unchanged afternoon. The light held each figure with the same clear, unvarying attention it gave to everything on the plain. Nothing was emphasized. Nothing was diminished. Each man sat or stood in his own portion of the space they shared, and the isle held all of it without preference. The way good ground holds whatever is placed upon it, Rhadamanthus did not approach. He stood at the margin where he had always stood, present to what was forming on the shore below him. Not the first thread now, but the second, and the third suggested in the closing distance of Ajax's shoulders. The isle worked in this manner, not through arrival alone, but through what arrived after arrival. The ordinary accumulation of proximity, the quiet insistence of shared ground. The Zephyrus touched the back of his robe as it moved past him up toward the central rise. He let it pass without turning to follow its progress. He already knew where it was going. He had always known. And the plain received it without interruption, the golden flowers bowing forward along every ridge until not a single stem on the whole face of the slope was standing fully upright, all of them bent in the same direction, attending to the same mild, persistent breath. The golden flowers recovered from the last passage of the Zephyrus and stood upright again in the stillness that followed. Rhadamanthus observed this too. The recovery, the way the stems returned to their full height without effort, without the slight uncertainty that grasses on the living earth sometimes showed after a strong wind, as though unsure the wind had truly finished. Here the recovery was complete and unhesitating. The flowers knew what followed the Zephyrus. They had known it every time. He turned his attention back to the shore. Menelaus had not spoken again since his last exchange with Achilles. But the silence between them now had a different texture than the silence of his arrival. Then it had been the silence of a man holding himself carefully together, monitoring the distance between himself and what was unfamiliar. Now it was simply silence. The breathing space between one thing and the next. He sat with his hands resting on his knees, and his hands were still. This was the thing Rhadamanthus watched for when it came. Not the moment of arrival, which was always dramatic in its own quiet way, not the first exchange of words, which could be performed before a man had truly settled, but the hands. The way the body eventually stopped preparing itself for something that was not coming. Menelaus's hands on his knees were the hands of a man who had stopped rehearsing. It had taken Achilles longer. Rhadamanthus did not dwell on the comparison, but he held it briefly the way a man holds a stone he has examined many times, running his thumb across its known surface. Achilles had arrived carrying the accumulated force of a life spent at the extreme edge of mortal experience. He had arrived bright with it. That brightness had taken considerable time to soften into something he could set down. He had not been unwilling. He had simply been unable to recognize for a long while that the striving was no longer required of him. The recognition had come eventually. Rhadamanthus had watched it happen, not a single moment, but a gradual redistribution of the man's attention, like a tide pulling back from a shore it had occupied for a very long time. And then Achilles had sat down on the grass near the Oceanus, and Patroclus had sat beside him, and the distance between where Achilles had been and where he was now had become simply part of the plain's long history. Unremarkable recorded. Below on the shore Achilles said nothing. He was looking out at the Oceanus with the particular quality of attention that belonged to those who had stopped looking for something and were simply looking. The water's surface held the same, even light, the sky held. Neither of them demanded anything of the men who sat before them. The Oceanus moved at its own continuous pace, indifferent to whether anyone watched it, and in that indifference there was a kind of generosity. It asked no witness. It received whatever attention was offered and returned it unchanged. To the giver, Patroclus had lowered his face from the sky. He was watching the water now as well, his hands still flat on the ground behind him. The shift was small. A slight repositioning of his gaze, nothing more. But it placed him in alignment with Achilles, both men facing the same direction, the same wide plain of water before them. And though neither had made any move to bring this about, the alignment was there. Ajax remained where he had been throughout the afternoon. His great frame was settled against itself in the way of a structure that has found its final resting position and requires no further adjustment. He did not look at the others. He did not look away from them either exactly. He occupied his own ground on the shore with a completeness that made the question of direction seem beside the point. He was simply present in the way large, still things are present, as a rock is present in a stream. The Oceanus moved. The grasses moved. Nothing else moved on the plain. Rhadamanthus considered what Homer had observed long ago, when the living world had still carried some clear knowledge of this place. No snow, no cold wind, no rain, only the gentle breath of the Zephyrus moving always from the west, cooling the men the Oceanus held within its arms. He had heard these words repeated by souls arriving here, sometimes murmured to themselves as they first stood on the shore. Recognizing in the physical fact of the air and the light the description they had carried all their lives, without fully believing it could be literal, it was literal. The ease was not a metaphor for something else. The warmth that held the plain without weight was not a symbol of divine favor, though it was that too. It was simply warmth, air that required nothing of those who breathed it. The particular mercy of a climate that had excised every discomfort without replacing it with the absence of sensation. Menelaus had noticed this early in his arrival. Rhadamanthus had watched the man's first breath on the plain, the slight expansion of his chest, the moment of stillness after, as though he were deciding whether to trust the sensation. He had trusted it slowly. Over the hours since, his breathing had deepened without his directing it to. The plain had done what it always did. It had taken the body's old instructions away from it one by one, so gently that the body had not resisted. The wandering was over for Menelaus. This was the fact beneath all the small observed facts of the afternoon. He had wandered across the living world for years after Troy, diverted by winds and divine will from a return that should have been straightforward. Turned back from harbour after harbour, his route lengthened past all reasonable proportion. He had endured it because he was the kind of man who endured what was given to him. He had not been diminished by the wandering. He had arrived here intact, carrying all of himself. but the wandering was over. Rhadamanthus understood the particular weight that carried. He had watched many souls arrive here bearing exactly that knowledge, not grief exactly, not relief, though relief was present too, but the strange, slow recognition that a long effort had completed, that the final step had been taken and there were no more steps required. Some souls needed considerable time before they could set that knowledge down and simply be where they were without measuring it against where they had been. Menelaus's hands on his knees were still. The afternoon held its even light over everything on the plain. Cronus sat on the central rise in the same fixed position he had maintained since morning, the pale grasses parting softly around him. A figure so accustomed to time that time had lost its power to disturb him. Achilles faced the water. Patroclus faced the water. Ajax faced the water. And the Oceanus received all of their attention and the afternoon's light equally, without distinctions, its surface moving in the same continuous, unhurried way it had always moved. Rhadamanthus stood where he stood. He had arrived at his own kind of stillness long ago, through the accumulation of afternoons precisely like this one. Not one afternoon that had taught him everything, but the long succession of them, each one adding its small weight to the same place, until what was there had become something dense and solid and reliable. He watched the shore. He watched the light. The Zephyrus came again from the west. It crossed the surface of the Oceanus, bending it slightly, and reached the grasses at the margin where they bent and recovered. Bent and recovered, the same motion they had made every time the wind came through. The golden flowers on the slope took the wind in their stems and dipped, and the wave of their dipping moved up the slope one row after another until it reached the pale grasses near Cronus, where it became something softer. Barely a movement, the faintest lean of each thin blade in the same direction before the wind passed on. At the shore, Achilles turned his head slightly toward Menelaus. Not to speak, simply to look, in the way men who have made room for each other sometimes look, registering the continued presence of the other with the same ease they would register the continued presence of the sky. Menelaus did not look back, but the line of his jaw softened by a degree that Rhadamanthus, watching from his position above, did not miss. The plain held all of it in its unchanging afternoon. The Oceanus continued its long, soft approach to the shore, withdrawing. Returning, withdrawing again, leaving a thin line of brightness along the very lowest reach of the grasses where the water touched them and drew back, touched them and drew back, the same patient brightness repeating itself along the margin of the isle. Rhadamanthus did not move from his position on the rise. Below him, the shore held its arrangement of souls without rearranging them. Ajax had not shifted. Patroclus had not shifted. Achilles had turned his head once and then let it return to its original bearing, the line of his gaze settling back on the Oceanus with the ease of long habit. Rhadamanthus let his attention move, as it sometimes did in the long afternoons of the plain, from what was present to what was not. This was not grief. It was not regret. It was something more particular than either. It was the knowledge, carried from before his arrival here, of what lay on the other side of the judgment seat, the other paths, the ones that did not lead to this plain, to this shore, to this unchanging afternoon light. He had weighed souls at the seat for longer than living men could calculate. He had stood beside Minos and Ajax through every category of human failure and human achievement. He had sent souls in 3 directions. Not all of them in the same direction, not most of them even in this one. The plain existed alongside its opposite. That was the fact Rhadamanthus carried, and it gave the plain its particular quality. Not its beauty, which required no contrast to be beautiful, but its comprehensibility. The meaning of the ease, the meaning of the light, could not be held fully without knowing what existed beyond the crossroads, where the other path went. What it produced. Tartarus lay at a distance the living could not measure. It was not visible from the plain. No sound reached here from it. The Zephyrus came from the west, from the open water, and carried nothing of Tartarus in it. The golden flowers on the slope had no knowledge of what existed in the downward dark. But Rhadamanthus knew, he had known since the first soul he had turned in that direction, since the first verdict that sent a shade toward the lower deep rather than toward this shore. Tantalus was there. Rhadamanthus could name the weight of that verdict. Tantalus, who had been given access to the table of the gods and had taken from it rather than received it, who had brought the sacred knowledge of Olympus back to mortal men for his own elevation, who had, in the darkest version of his error, done worse than that. The trial of Tantalus had not been simple. No trial that ended in Tartarus was simple. But it had been clear. The verdict had not been in doubt once all three judges had heard the whole account. It had still cost something to deliver. Sisyphus was there. Sisyphus, who had cheated death itself twice, who had put Thanatos in chains and let the world fill with men who could not die, who had bargained and tricked his way through divine arrangements with the persistent creativity of someone who understood that rules were merely obstacles at a particular angle. Rhadamanthus had seen craftiness in many souls. Craftiness was not a punishable quality by itself. It was the particular shape of Sisyphus's craftiness that had mattered, its direction. The fact that it was never turned toward anything but his own continuation, his own advantage, that even at the end he had been calculating how to extend the account further. There was no virtue to weigh against it, because the man had not believed virtue to be real. The hill he pushed his stone up was real enough. Ixion was there, and the nature of Ixion's punishment was its own kind of commentary. The wheel that spun him through the air of Tartarus without stopping, without arriving anywhere, was a punishment shaped by what he had done rather than imposed on it from outside. He had grasped at something that could not be grasped. He had reached for what was not his and never could have been his, and the spinning was the shape of that reaching made permanent. Rhadamanthus did not dwell in these recollections with satisfaction. That was important to name. Even to himself, in the privacy of his own attention, the verdicts had been just. He believed that without qualification. But justice was not a warm thing, not in the way the plain was warm. It was a different quality altogether, precise where warmth was broad, absolute where warmth was encompassing. He had never confused the two, but standing here, watching the shore below, he felt the distance between them clearly. The plain did not know about Tartarus. That was what made the plain the plain. The souls who rested on this shore had laid everything down. Achilles was not thinking, in this moment, of the bronze point that had ended him at Troy. Menelaus was not measuring this shore against the harbour he had been turned away from, the years of wandering that had preceded his arrival. They had been released from the backward motion of memory into something more immediate, the grasses under their hands, the sound of the Oceanus at its work. The afternoon that held everything equally without requiring anything in return. Rhadamanthus held what they had released. That was, he had come to understand, one of the functions of his position on the rise above the shore. He was not a guardian in the conventional sense. Nothing threatened this plane. Nothing could enter it that had not been judged fit to enter it. But he held the knowledge that the souls here had set down, the knowledge of the other paths. The weight of what the tribunal had decided across all the long years of its work. He held it not as a burden, but as a kind of necessary ballast. The plain needed someone who remembered the whole account, even as its inhabitants were permitted to forget the parts of it that had cost them most. Cronus sat on the rise with a different knowledge. He had fallen from a height greater than any mortal soul that arrived here had ever occupied. The Titanomachy was not a human-scaled event. The loss of the sky, the loss of his children, the long decades of Tartarus before the eventual release. The slow translation to this shore, where he sat now in what Rhadamanthus had never been able to determine was either peace or its near approximation. Cronus did not speak often. When he did, it was briefly, but he remained, and his remaining was its own testimony. The descent he had survived was the steepest descent in the history of the gods. That he sat now among the pale grasses at the top of the gentle rise, receiving the Zephyrus as it passed, was a fact that Rhadamanthus found clarifying in ways he could not always articulate. Even the deepest fall had, apparently, a place to land. Not every fall. Not Tantalus, not Sisyphus, not Ixion. There was no symmetry being offered here, no comfortable principle that suffering eventually resolves into ease. The wheel of Ixion did not stop. The stone of Sisyphus did not stay. Those verdicts were what they were, and Rhadamanthus had delivered them, and he did not revise them in the privacy of this afternoon. But Cronus sat on the rise, and below the rise the golden flowers dipped again as the Zephyrus returned. The wave of their dipping moved through them in the same unhurried sequence, row by row up the slope, reaching the pale grasses near the old king and dying there into something barely visible. Achilles sat at the shore. Menelaus sat with his hands on his knees still. The Oceanus drew its thin line of brightness along the margin of the grasses and withdrew it and drew it again. Rhadamanthus looked at all of it. The judgment and the plain existed together. Neither cancelled the other. The stone in Tartarus ground against its hill, and here the light lay across the water without asking anything of the water. Both were true, both continued. He had weighed souls long enough to stop expecting the two facts to resolve themselves into a single, cleaner fact. They did not resolve. They simply coexisted. As the afternoon coexisted with the knowledge of all the afternoons that would never come for the souls who had gone the other way. Rhadamanthus stood where he stood. The Oceanus moved. The grasses at the shore bent and recovered, the same small motion they had made throughout the long afternoon. Patient against the waterline, returning to upright after every contact with the retreating wave. The afternoon on the plain had no visible end. That was one of its properties. Not a trick, not a mercy exactly, but a condition. The light that lay across the Oceanus did not angle toward dusk. The Zephyrus did not carry the cooling that evening brings to mortal shores. The afternoon simply continued, holding itself at the same generous pitch it had always held, and the souls below the rise received it without asking why it did not change. Rhadamanthus had spent considerable time, in the early period of his tenure here, waiting for the light to shift. Old habit. A judge measures time. Time is what separates the act from the accounting, the life from the weighing of it. But the light on this shore refused measurement. It offered itself whole without fraction, and, eventually, Rhadamanthus had stopped reaching for a different quality of it. He looked at the slope below. The golden flowers were still. The Zephyrus had briefly withdrawn, as it sometimes did, and in its absence the flowers stood upright along the slope, their heads unmoving, catching the light with a straightforward completeness. Then the wind returned from the west, and the dipping moved through them again in its unhurried row-by-row sequence, up the slope, past the midpoint, dying into the pale grasses near the crest before Cronus's still form, where the old king continued to sit with his hands loose at his sides. Cronus did not appear to be watching the flowers. He did not appear to be watching anything in particular. His gaze held the general direction of the Oceanus without, Rhadamanthus thought, actually attending to it. This was different from the way Achilles sat at the water's edge. Achilles looked at the Oceanus with a directness that had never quite left him. Even here, even released from the backward pull of memory, there was something in his posture that recognized the vast water in front of him, not as an obstacle or a destination, simply as a presence worthy of recognition from another presence. Menelaus had not moved. His hands remained on his knees. His back held a slight forward incline, the posture of a man who spent years aboard ships, years leaning into whatever distance remained between himself and the shore he sought. The distance here was nothing. He had arrived. And yet the posture remained, like a mark left in wood, a groove worn by long use that outlasts the use itself. He was not suffering. That much was clear from any angle. But the body remembered its long directions even after the mind had laid them down. Patroclus sat near Achilles without touching him. That was how they had been throughout the long afternoon. Close enough that the space between them was a considered space, not an accidental one. They did not need speech. Whatever had been said between them across all the years that preceded this shore had either already been said or no longer required saying. They occupied the same quiet in the way that two things belonging to the same condition occupy it, fully, without friction. Ajax sat apart from them. Not far apart, only the distance of a few strides. But distinct, as Ajax had always been distinct, a figure who occupied his own perimeter even in company. His large hands rested on the grass. He looked at the water with the same patient attention he had given everything in life that did not require cleverness. Ajax had never been a man of complicated thinking. The shore suited him in a direct way. He had come to it, and it had received him, and the accounting had been clean. Rhadamanthus thought about the living. This was not something he did often. The living were not his domain. They moved through their brief spans on the mortal side of the tribunal's reach, and what they did there was not his to arrange or interrupt. But occasionally, on an afternoon like this one, when everything on the plain had reached a kind of sustained equilibrium, he found himself thinking about the effect that this shore had produced in the world above. The poets had carried it. Pindar had carried it most precisely. His odes had moved through the Greek world like the Zephyrus itself, reaching into the lives of athletes and kings and ordinary men and women who wanted to understand what their virtue might be worth. He had described the Isle of the Blessed with a specificity that had surprised Rhadamanthus when he first encountered reports of it. The golden flowers, the Oceanus breezes, the souls of the thrice virtuous arriving after 3 incarnations lived with clear intent. Pindar had understood that the promise of this shore was not merely consolation, it was a design principle, something to build a life against. People had lived differently because of what they believed this shore to be. Not all of them, not even most of them, but some. Farmers who kept their oaths when breaking them would have cost them nothing. Men and women who turned back from cruelties they could have committed without consequence. The promise of Elysium had worked in the living world the way Rhadamanthus worked at the tribunal, not by watching every act, but by being known to exist. The judgment did not have to be witnessed to be effective. It only had to be believed in, trusted to operate correctly when the time came. That was a kind of justice too. Quieter, operating at greater distance. The Oceanus moved below. The grasses bent at the waterline and came back upright. The same small motion, patient and exact. Rhadamanthus watched it with the same attention he had given it throughout the long afternoon. The souls on this shore would continue here. Others would arrive, as they had always arrived, carrying the full account of their 3 lives. Or the single life judged sufficient, laid before the tribunal, and found to have more light in it than darkness. The roads from the judgment seat would continue to diverge. Tartarus, Asphodel, Elysium. The 3 paths were not changing. The criteria were not changing. The Zephyrus would continue to arrive from the west, and the golden flowers would continue to dip in sequence. And Cronus would continue to sit near the pale grasses in his particular quality of rest. This shore had been built from the oldest materials available. Justice, memory, the willingness to receive those who had earned receiving. The ancient Greeks have more to teach us, more tales to share. If you made it to the end, thank you. Take a moment to like and subscribe if these stories have become part of your nights, and let me know in the comments that you stayed. It always means something to know who was here. The Zephyrus came again from the west. It moved across the Oceanus, gathered nothing, brought nothing foreign, and arrived at the shore as it had arrived all afternoon, warm, unhurried, carrying only itself. The golden flowers dipped along the slope, row by row, up toward the pale grasses. The line of brightness at the water's edge drew itself along the margin and withdrew. Rhadamanthus stood on the rise, holding what he held. Below him, Achilles lifted his face briefly toward the wind, and then lowered it again, eyes returning to the water. One hand resting open on the grass beside him, palm upward, receiving the afternoon without question,